Welcome to Victorian Britain, an era so polite it could make a handshake feel like a hostage situation. It's the mid-19th century, and the world is wearing its best face powder and pretending everything is fine. Coal smoke rolls through the streets like a permanent fog machine. The sound of carriage wheels clatters over cobblestones, and every parlour hums with one unspoken rule: behave properly or perish socially. Victorian politeness wasn't a social code. It was a full-time survival strategy. You didn't just act nice. You performed niceness with the desperation of someone auditioning for heaven. Every move, word and glance carried moral weight. Smiling too wide, vulgar, laughing too loudly, indecent, showing emotion, positively French, and therefore unforgivable. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In this world, good manners were not optional flourishes. They were armour. They told people who you were, where you came from, and whether you were respectable enough to be allowed near the teapot. To the Victorians, manners were civilization itself, the fragile line separating humans from savages, or worse, the working class. The Industrial Revolution had birthed a new middle class, people who had money, but not necessarily breeding. And oh, how that terrified the old aristocracy. Suddenly, merchants and factory owners could afford velvet curtains and imported china, but could they use them correctly? Society became a stage play, and everyone was scrambling for their lines. The result? A nationwide identity crisis dressed in satin and self-consciousness. Etiquette manuals flooded the market faster than you could say, "Pardon me." Books with titles like The Habits of Good Society and How to Behave, a pocket manual of Republican etiquette, instructed readers on everything from how to stand correctly to how to address a duke without spontaneous combustion. Manners became industrialized, mass-produced civility for the newly prosperous. Everyone wanted to appear genteel. No one wanted to be caught eating a pear the wrong way, because of course, pears were to be eaten with a knife and fork. Using your hands was one step away from barbarism. The drawing room was the epicenter of this madness, a glittering theatre of restraint. Picture it, ladies perched on the edge of stiff-backed chairs, men standing like furniture with moral opinions. Conversations were polite to the point of anesthesia. One did not discuss politics, money, illness, or anything remotely resembling reality. If it wasn't about the weather, literature, or the delightful quality of the pianoforte, it simply didn't exist. The fear of social disgrace was omnipresent. One slip, one uncouth gesture, one improper phrase, and your reputation could shatter like fine china underfoot. A misused fork might not kill you, but it could kill your marriage prospects. Politeness was not about kindness. It was about control. A strict hierarchy of manners ensured everyone knew their place and stayed in it. The irony: beneath this lossy surface of civility simmered insecurity. The Victorians were obsessed with propriety precisely because they were terrified of exposure. The empire was expanding, cities were swelling, and the old world of clear social boundaries was collapsing under the weight of coal dust and capitalism. Manners were a desperate attempt to reassert order, to build a moral scaffolding over a rapidly changing world. In other words, the Victorians didn't just love rules, they needed them like oxygen. But etiquette didn't just regulate behaviour, it reshaped bodies. Corsets cinched women into impossible shapes. Posture correctors trained spines to obey social rank. The body itself became a public statement. You could be hungry, poor, or miserable, but as long as you stood straight and spoke softly, you were civilized. The good news? You were alive. The bad news? So were the expectations. Even the simplest acts, walking, sitting, eating, became performances of restraint. Politeness meant pretending your body didn't exist. Hunger, exhaustion, sweat, even comfort, all were signs of weakness. Being polite was not just about self-control, it was about self-denial. The ideal Victorian was a porcelain doll, powered by guilt and afternoon tea. Of course, this suffocating politeness produced its share of absurdities. People bowed and curtsied themselves into back pain. Entire conversations were held about the correct way to knock on a door. 3 polite taps, no more, no less, lest you be mistaken for the help or a criminal. And don't even think about blowing your nose in public. That was a moral offence on par with treason. Yet behind the absurdity lay something darker. Manners became moral weapons. The upper classes used etiquette to gatekeep virtue itself. If you didn't know the right words or gestures, you weren't just uncultured, but you were immoral. Goodness was measured not by compassion, but by composure. It wasn't enough to be decent, you had to look decent. In the end, Victorian etiquette didn't just organise society, it imprisoned it. Everyone was trapped behind a curtain of good behaviour, terrified of the slightest human misstep. Civilization had triumphed, yes, but at the cost of spontaneity, laughter and joy. Life became one long rehearsal for a performance no one truly enjoyed. And so, as the century marched on, Britain became the world's most polished anxiety attack. The empire conquered continents, but at home, people were conquering themselves. Because in Victorian society, politeness wasn't just about manners, it was about survival. They called it civility. We might call it collective nervous breakdown, served with tea and judgment. If you were born in Victorian Britain, congratulations. Your first gift wasn't a rattle. It was responsibility. You didn't just enter the world, you entered a finishing school with no finish line. The midwife's first words weren't "it's a boy" or "it's a girl," but rather, make sure it sits up straight. Victorian childhood was less about joy and more about apprenticeship in repression. From the moment you could hold a spoon incorrectly, most likely, your every movement was evaluated. A baby's first cry wasn't a tender sign of life, it was the first moral test. Cry too loudly and you'd be labelled unruly. Cry too softly and you were weak. Either way, the nursery wasn't a sanctuary. It was an etiquette boot camp disguised in lace. For the wealthy, nannies and governesses ran this regime with military precision. There was a right way to breathe, a correct way to stand, and a socially acceptable level of enthusiasm for existence. The golden rule: never display an emotion you can't later apologise for. Children were told to speak only when spoken to, sit perfectly still, and express gratitude for every bland porridge spoonful, as though it were divine intervention. Victorian society didn't really believe in childhood the way we do now. The concept of carefree innocence was a sentimental fiction saved for paintings and poems. In real life, a child was just a small adult, expected to display poise, modesty, and a healthy fear of both God and the dinner table. A child laughing too freely might be common, a child fidgeting was ill-bred, and a child asking why, well, that bordered on blasphemy. Every home was a classroom of correctness. Little boys were trained to bow, to control their voices, and to keep their hands visible at all times. Pockets were suspiciously associated with mischief. Little girls were trained to curtsy, to never raise their voices above a polite hum, and to fold their hands neatly like decorative furniture. The most dreadful fate. Becoming known as forward, Victorian code for having a personality. Even the toys came with lessons in social order. Dolls were practice babies for motherhood. Miniature tea sets prepared girls for the thrilling future of pouring hot water for men who would never thank them properly. Boys were given toy soldiers and trains, because heaven forbid they learn empathy before empire. Imagination was acceptable only if it led to self-restraint. Children were constantly reminded that their behaviour reflected their family's reputation. The phrase "children should be seen and not heard" wasn't just a saying, it was a commandment carved into the nation's collective conscience. If your child spoke out of turn at a dinner party, you could expect weeks of social exile and whispers about poor upbringing. The stakes were absurdly high for people still losing their baby teeth. In middle-class homes, where social mobility was a constant tightrope walk, manners were everything. Parents obsessed over deportment lessons, hiring governesses who could sculpt character the way tailors sculpted waistlines. They didn't want their children merely polite, they wanted them bulletproof polite. Imagine growing up knowing one misused greeting could tank your family's chances of being invited to the right Christmas ball. Discipline was physical as well as psychological. The cane, the slipper, and the stern lecture all reinforced one truth: good manners hurt. Posture correction devices ensured children sat straight even when they slept. Writing lessons focused on perfect penmanship, because a sloppy R might reveal moral rot. Some manuals even suggested punishing left-handedness, as though being ambidextrous were a gateway to crime. The greatest crime of all? Spontaneity. Fun was something Victorians treated like smallpox, dangerous and to be eradicated early. A child who giggled too long risked being sent to bed to reflect. A child who spoke passionately was taught to compose oneself. Emotional control was prized above intelligence or curiosity. By the time most children reached adolescence, they could suppress feelings with the skill of trained diplomats, or at least until they collapsed dramatically in their 30s from nervous exhaustion. Of course, religion backed this system like a strict headmaster. The Church of England reinforced the belief that discipline was divine. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a proverb, it was policy. Heaven, Victorians believed, was tidy, silent and well-mannered. The devil surely had bad posture and chewed with his mouth open, and let's not forget the poor who endured their own version of moral education. Philanthropic reformers preached that good manners could elevate the working classes. Orphans in charitable institutions were drilled to curtsy to benefactors before eating watery soup, because nothing said gratitude like stomach cramps and etiquette. Even street children were lectured on politeness by middle-class ladies who would faint if they ever smelled real poverty. The result? A society where no one truly relaxed. Children learned early that love was conditional, respect was earned through compliance, and silence was safer than truth. Politeness didn't make better people, it made better actors. Everyone learned to smile through discomfort, to apologize for breathing, and to suppress anything remotely human until it could be written about tastefully in a diary. The sad irony was that the same parents who demanded robotic composure from their children were also nostalgic about childhood innocence. They adored paintings of cherubic faces and sentimental poems about little angels, but real living children? Those needed discipline and a straight back. So yes, if you were born Victorian, you didn't learn to walk, you learned to apologise for it. And when you finally mastered that, you graduated into a lifetime of saying, "Pardon me," for existing slightly too loudly. Because in Victorian Britain, good manners began at birth, and happiness was considered a distraction from your moral education. They didn't raise children, they assembled future adults, one suppressed emotion at a time. In Victorian Britain, speech wasn't the only language that mattered. In fact, it was probably the least important one. The true dialect of the upper and middle classes was body language, posture, and porcelain precision. You didn't need to open your mouth to reveal your class. Your teacup, your walk, and even your breathing habits did it for you. One wrong pinky angle, and you might as well have declared bankruptcy in public. Victorian society operated like a silent performance where everyone was fluent in judgment. To the untrained eye, a tea party looked tranquil. Lace gloves, quiet conversation, polite laughter. But beneath the surface, it was warfare conducted with saucers and spiles. Every gesture meant something. Every movement whispered status. Even gravity seemed biased toward the aristocracy. It only pulled down those who slouched. Posture was the first battleground. Uprightness wasn't just a matter of spinal health. It was a moral imperative. The wealthy stood straight because they could afford to. They weren't bent from factory labour, household chores, or the weight of actual work. Their posture shouted, "My hands have never touched anything useful." A lady's deportment was proof of her upbringing. A gentleman's stance was proof of his superiority. To slouch was to slide towards sin, both social and spiritual. Etiquette manuals preached the gospel of geometry. Backs were to be straight, shoulders relaxed but firm, heads tilted at just the right angle to seem approachable yet dignified. The result was a nation of human chandeliers, beautiful, upright, and completely useless for practical purposes. Some even wore posture braces under their clothing, a hidden scaffold of social performance. Good posture wasn't about confidence, it was about class discipline. Then there was the voice. Tone, volume, and enunciation all acted as social passports. The upper classes cultivated a sound known today as received pronunciation, or more bluntly, I'm better than you English. It wasn't just an accent, it was a declaration of refinement. Speaking too loudly suggested poor breeding. Speaking too softly implied nervousness or guilt. The ideal voice floated gently into the air like perfumed air from a fan. Anything more passionate risked sounding common. Lower-class accents, meanwhile, were treated like contagious diseases. Elocution schools flourished, promising to scrub away regional twangs and working-class vowels the way bleach removes stains. The lesson was simple. If you didn't sound like money, you'd never be near it. Even servants were trained to modulate their voices, polite enough to please, silent enough to vanish. And then, of course, came the fine art of holding a teacup. This was the Olympic sport of Victorian gentility. Tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a personality test with steam. The correct way to hold a teacup was a matter of national importance. Thumb and forefinger delicately pinched the handle, the middle finger supported from below. The pinky? Ah yes, the pinky. That treacherous little show-off. Contrary to popular myth, the raised pinky was not always correct. Done subtly, it implied refinement. Extended too far, it screamed pretension louder than a street vendor. To sip too quickly meant impatience. Too slowly, arrogance. You weren't judged by your soul, just your saucer. The act of drinking tea was essentially a job interview that never ended, and heaven help you if you rattled your spoon or clinked your cup. That sound was social death echoing across the drawing room. But the tyranny of silent class language extended beyond the table. How one moved through space was equally revealing. Aristocrats were trained to glide, a kind of slow-motion float that conveyed serenity and breeding. Their steps made no sound, as if the air itself carried them. Working-class people, by contrast, walked. You could hear their footsteps, decisive, practical, unrefined. The rich didn't rush, only civilians did that. Moving too fast suggested urgency, and urgency implied work. The ultimate vulgarity. Even facial expressions were class-coded. The well-bred face was a mask of calm detachment, what one manual called the serenity of virtue. Smiling too widely was vulgar, frowning was impolite. The ideal expression hovered somewhere between mild amusement and mild indigestion. Eyes should never dart. That was for thieves and romantics. Everything about a noble face said, I have never known discomfort, and I intend to keep it that way. Clothing, naturally, was the loudest form of silent speech. But what mattered most wasn't just the fabric, it was how you wore it. A lower-class person might buy fashionable garments, but without the proper posture and poise, they'd still be spotted as imposters. Manners were the invisible embroidery that completed the outfit. You could wear silk, but if you didn't move like silk, society saw right through you. And then there was the art of stillness, the ultimate display of refinement. The higher your status, the less you needed to move. Upper-class Victorians were practically statues in motionless grace, while servants bustled invisibly around them. To remain unbothered while chaos unfolded was proof of breeding. A noble woman could sit through a minor earthquake and call it a slight disturbance. Stillness equaled superiority, movement equaled labour. The aristocracy ruled by barely existing. All of this meant that the Victorians lived in a world of constant surveillance, where every flick of a wrist could elevate or destroy. You didn't need spies, you had tea parties. People watched, interpreted, and gossiped like it was a competitive sport. Reputation wasn't earned by deeds, but by the choreography of daily life. By the end of the century, these unspoken codes had become so intricate that they were practically a new form of literacy, one that kept the classes neatly separated without a word being said. Even as factories roared and the empire expanded, the true measure of success remained delicate and quiet. How gracefully one could lift a cup without revealing the shaking underneath. So yes, in a society obsessed with manners, status wasn't declared, it was performed. And while the poor toiled in noise and sweat, the upper classes perfected the art of silent superiority. You weren't judged by your soul, just your saucer. And if you dropped that saucer, well, your social life shattered right along with it. In Victorian Britain, language was not a tool of communication. It was a weapon of polite warfare. You didn't speak to express. You spoke to impress, conceal, or strategically destroy. Conversation wasn't about honesty. It was about survival. Every word had to be polished, perfumed, and disguised. The Victorians mastered a linguistic art form that can best be described as emotional taxidermy. Everything looked alive, but nothing truly was. Politeness was power, and speech was its most treacherous battlefield. While other eras had swords and muskets, the Victorians fought with adjectives and pauses. A simple "how interesting" could mean "you've bored me beyond reason." A measured indeed could mean "I despise you, but the room is watching." If there was one universal language in the 19th century, it was the art of pretending you didn't hate anyone, especially when you did. Victorian small talk was like chess. One wrong move, and you were socially executed. Conversation followed an unspoken script where nothing was said directly and everything was implied. To the modern ear, it might sound exhausting, but to a Victorian, it was the essence of civilization. After all, bluntness was for Americans and barbarians, two equally suspicious categories. Let's begin with the compliment, that delicate dagger wrapped in lace. When a Victorian lady said, "What a charming little dress," she wasn't praising your fashion sense. She was calling it cheap. When she said, "How bold of you to wear that colour," it wasn't encouragement. It was a public obituary for your taste, and the ultimate insult. "You look well," Victorian ton decode. That meant, "You've gained weight." Entire friendships disintegrated under the strain of well-meant niceties. Men weren't safe either. A gentleman might praise another's horse as spirited, which meant dangerously uncontrollable, or describe a rival as very sure of himself, which meant unbearably arrogant. Gossip thrived in this doublespeak economy. Entire lives could be ruined with one raised eyebrow or a phrase like, "He is quite devoted to his hobbies," which was code for "he drinks before noon." This labyrinthine speech wasn't random, it was designed. The Victorians believed directness was a moral flaw. You didn't confront, you suggested. You didn't criticize, you implied concern. A lady might not say you're embarrassing yourself, but she might murmur, "How refreshing to see someone so unbothered by convention." Translation: "You're a disgrace to God and upholstery." Even emotions had to pass through layers of verbal customs. Love, anger, grief, all were filtered through polite phrasing, until they came out as vague generalities. "I was quite taken aback" could mean "I am furious." "He is somewhat trying" translated to "he should be exiled." This was not communication, it was choreography. To make things more complicated, tone was everything. A sentence as simple as "how kind of you" could express genuine gratitude, mild annoyance, or existential despair, depending on how long one paused before the word kind. The Victorians invented sarcasm before it was cool, but they delivered it so gently you'd thank them for it. Why all the linguistic gymnastics? Because words had consequences. In a society obsessed with reputation, saying the wrong thing could end marriages, friendships, or even careers. A misplaced comment at a dinner party could be repeated, distorted, and printed in the gossip columns by morning. In polite society, conversation was surveillance. You were always being listened to, not by spies, but by people with excellent hearing and terrible hobbies. This culture of coded speech created a peculiar social anxiety. People rehearse sentences the way actors rehearse lines. Manuals on correct conversation sold nearly as well as etiquette guides. These books offered thrilling advice like avoid jokes, avoid politics, avoid discussing digestion. In short, avoid everything that might make you interesting. The safest topics were weather, art, and the moral superiority of one's furniture. Courtship made this dance even more absurd. Flirting was a performance of restraint so exaggerated it bordered on parody. A man might declare affection by complimenting a lady's parasol, which somehow translated to, "I wish to marry you." A woman might drop her handkerchief at his feet. A gesture so laden with subtext it could cause a scandal if noticed by the wrong aunt. Nothing was spoken outright. Everything was whispered between the lines. The entire empire was held together by meaningful silences. But repression had its consequences. Beneath the politeness, Victorians were emotional volcanoes in top hats and corsets. When you spend your life saying, "how lovely," instead of "I'm miserable," something's bound to explode. Diaries, letters, and poetry became the only safe outlets for honesty, and a gentleman who couldn't tell his wife he loved her might instead write her a 12-page letter about the tranquility of domestic virtue, hoping she'd translate it correctly. The irony was that this obsession with verbal delicacy didn't prevent cruelty, it merely beautified it. People still insulted, excluded, and humiliated one another. They just did it with perfect grammar. Hypocrisy was not a bug in the system, it was the entire operating model. The more refined your phrasing, the less you had to mean it. It was possible to ruin someone's life with a smile and a compliment, and be applauded for your tact. By the late Victorian era, some critics began to notice the absurdity. Satirists like Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw skewered polite conversation, pointing out that a society obsessed with appearances couldn't possibly be honest. Wilde once quipped, "A gentleman never insults anyone unintentionally," the unofficial motto of the age. In the end, Victorian conversation was less about connection and more about camouflage. You weren't trying to be understood, you were trying to survive. Every parlour, drawing room and ballroom was a linguistic minefield, where silence was safer than sincerity. So if you ever find yourself transported to the 19th century, remember, don't speak plainly, don't reveal too much. Smile, nod, and when in doubt say, "how charming." Because in Victorian Britain, telling the truth wasn't rude, it was revolutionary. Dinner in Victorian Britain, where food wasn't the main course, anxiety was. The evening meal wasn't about nourishment or enjoyment. It was about proving that your bloodline could survive a 7-course meal without committing a single social crime. The dinner table was less a place of comfort and more a minefield lined with silverware. One wrong fork and you'd be socially forked. Let's set the scene. You've been invited to a dinner party, a phrase that to a Victorian carried the same dread as tax audit or unannounced bishop visit. You arrive dressed like a polished chandelier, only to find your true test isn't conversational charm, but cutlery. Before you even sit down, there are rules, hundreds of them, and they've all been written by people who believed enjoyment was vulgar. First, the seating arrangements. These were orchestrated like diplomatic negotiations. The host would assign every guest a specific seat based on rank, marital status, and how much gossip they generated last season. Sit too close to someone above your station, and you risked being branded forward. Sit too far and you looked ungrateful. By the time you finally located your place card, you had already lost half your appetite, and possibly your will to live. Once seated, posture became your next battlefield. You were expected to sit upright but relaxed, which was about as achievable as being simultaneously alive and embalmed. Leaning forward? Too eager. Leaning back? Too arrogant. Resting elbows on the table was a sin so grave it could lead to social excommunication. Every limb had a designated resting zone, and heaven help you if your knife wandered too far left. Now, about that cutlery. The Victorian table looked less like a dining setup and more like an instrument panel on a flying machine. Multiple forks, spoons, knives, each waiting to expose your ignorance. The rule was to work from the outside in, but panic made that knowledge vanish faster than a servant holding a dirty plate. There were oyster forks, salad forks, fish knives, butter knives, dessert spoons, an arsenal of utensils designed less for eating and more for testing your evolutionary fitness. And then there was the napkin. It had to be unfolded halfway, placed on the lap with discreet elegance, and never, under any circumstance, used for anything so barbaric as wiping one's face. If you dared to blot your mouth too vigorously, you might as well have stood up and confessed to piracy. The napkin's true purpose was symbolic, to demonstrate that your bodily fluids remained theoretical. The meal itself was a marathon of manners, chewing, silent and slow, with lips sealed so tightly you risk suffocation. Talking while eating was forbidden, but failing to talk between bites was equally rude. You were expected to hold a graceful conversation, witty but not too witty, charming but not too forward, while performing complex utensil choreography. If multitasking were an Olympic event, Victorians would have won gold in chewing while pretending to enjoy poetry. And let's not forget the soup course. The first real trial by fire. Soup was to be sipped away from you, not toward. The reasoning was unclear, but the consequences were absolute. Tilt the spoon the wrong way, and the room would freeze as though you'd committed treason. Making a slurping noise was an act of war. Dropping your spoon, that was social suicide. You'd spend the rest of the evening apologising to the ghost of propriety. Fish followed. A course that required its own special knife and fork shaped like tiny shovels. The fish knife was designed to separate delicate flesh from bones without stabbing, tearing, or showing any sign that you were aware fish had once been alive. Accidentally touch a bone with your fingers, and you'd be branded a savage. By dessert, most guests were less full of food and more full of suppressed terror. Wine etiquette was another labyrinth. You couldn't just drink, you had to signal for it properly. Servants hovered like invisible ghosts, refilling glasses only when prompted by subtle gestures, a glance, a nod, or the faint lift of a wrist. To ask verbally was coarse, to drink too quickly was desperate. The goal was to appear as though you didn't actually need liquid to survive. Hosts, meanwhile, bore their own burdens. They were responsible for the impossible task of keeping conversation light, laughter appropriate, and servants invisible. If a dish arrived lukewarm, or, God forbid, a guest found a hair in the pudding, it wasn't a culinary mishap. It was a moral failure. The hostess might not sleep for weeks, haunted by the memory of tepid gravy. For the servants, dinner was a ballet of silent obedience. They refilled glasses, cleared plates, and dodged emotional tension with the grace of trained assassins. One clumsy movement, one clatter of porcelain, and they'd vanish by morning. Manners were not just for the gentry, they were a performance required from every level of the household. Even laughter had rules. A soft chuckle was acceptable. A full laugh was considered an act of rebellion. Food might be delicious, but delighting in it too openly risked looking gluttonous. Dining was less about taste and more about theatrical restraint. It wasn't what you ate, it was how convincingly you could pretend you weren't hungry. And after all this effort, the posture, the silence, the utensil gymnastics, the greatest compliment one could receive at the end of the night was, "You conducted yourself admirably," which translated from Victorian meant, "You managed to eat soup without scandal, we're impressed you're still employable." The absurdity, of course, was that none of this had anything to do with refinement or kindness. It was about control, a social filtering system that separated the cultured from the core. Table manners were moral performance art. The poor ate to live, the rich dined to prove they existed correctly. So, as candles flickered and guests smiled through indigestion, one truth became clear. Victorian dinner parties weren't about food, they were about survival. Because in this world, a misplaced spoon wasn't a minor slip. It was a declaration of war. The good news, you've been invited to dinner. The bad news, you might not leave with your dignity or your dessert spoon. There are wars in history fought over borders, religion, and treasure. And then there were the Victorian dining wars fought silently with starched linen. To modernise, a napkin is just a napkin, a humble tool to catch soup drips and life's little accidents. But in Victorian Britain, that square of cloth was a sacred instrument of social warfare. It didn't merely sit on your lap, it broadcast your soul. Fold it wrong, and suddenly you'd propose marriage to your cousin. Dinner etiquette, as we've already seen, was a theatre of anxiety, but napkin etiquette was its finest act of absurdity. A napkin could make or break your reputation faster than gossip or gout. It was the one object at the table that everyone had, and therefore the one object through which society could judge you equally. It was the democracy of doom. Let's start with the arrival ritual. When the first course was announced, you couldn't just grab your napkin like some barbarian hungry for bread. Oh no, you had to wait for the hostess, the high priestess of decorum, to signal the moment. Only after she delicately unfolded her napkin were the guests permitted to follow suit. Move too soon, and you'd appear impatient. Move too late, and you'd look dim-witted. One wrong second, and you were a social time bomb wrapped in linen. But unfolding wasn't simple. You didn't just spread it open like a picnic blanket. The correct way was to unfold halfway, creating a soft triangle or rectangle. Etiquette. Manuals never quite agreed, which only deepened the panic. You placed it gently across your lap, smooth side facing upward, fold facing your waist. If the fold faced the wrong direction, well, there were entire families who never recovered from less. Once in place, the napkin became a living extension of your reputation. It couldn't move too often lest it draw attention. It couldn't sit untouched, or you'd appear indifferent to hygiene. You had to use it sparingly, discreetly, and above all, never let it witness enthusiasm. A single dramatic dab could make you look sweaty, nervous, or, heaven forbid, human. And let's talk about the face. The Victorian face was sacred ground. To wipe it openly was the visual equivalent of public nudity. Etiquette guides warned that no lady should apply her napkin to her mouth with vigour. Gentle dabbing was the rule, as if one were removing imaginary moisture from an imaginary dinner. Men were permitted slightly more freedom, but even they were cautioned not to disturb the symmetry of the countenance. The napkin also doubled as a secret code. The way you placed it, folded it, or abandoned it sent silent messages across the label. For instance, napkin placed neatly on your chair. I'll be back soon. Napkin left on the table beside your plate. I've finished. You may clear. Napkin thrown crumpled onto the plate. The dinner, and possibly civilization itself, has ended. These weren't just signals to servants. They were cues to everyone else. A misplaced napkin might lead to premature plate clearing, awkward stares, or the horrifying suspicion that you lacked upbringing. In one notorious account from 1873, a dinner guest accidentally dropped her napkin too soon. The host mistook it for a departure signal and rose from the table. The meal ended after only 2 courses, and the hostess never spoke to her again. Yes, a friendship destroyed by gravity. Now, here's where it gets deliciously absurd. Napkins weren't just practical, they were romantic minefields. In some circles, the way a gentleman returned his napkin at the end of the evening carried flirtatious meaning. Fold it neatly beside the plate. Polite gratitude. Fold it into a triangle. Gentle admiration. Hand it to the hostess personally. That was practically a proposal. There are even anecdotes, possibly exaggerated because this is Victorian Britain we're talking about, of hopeful bachelors trying to convey affection by accidentally leaving a monogrammed napkin behind. A risky move, one misplaced fold, and suddenly you were engaged to your second cousin from Bath. Servants, meanwhile, had to become napkin cryptographers. They learned to read these folds and placements like battlefield signals. A napkin slightly skewed meant, bring the next course. A napkin in perfect order meant, do not interrupt this tedious story. Servants who misread these signs risked wrath. A mistimed clearing could cost them their position, or at least several hours of stern, whispered humiliation. Napkins were also status symbols. The rich had them made of Irish linen so fine it could bankrupt a smaller nation. The poor used whatever scraps passed as cloth, but among the wealthy size mattered. Some households flaunted napkins so enormous they could double as togas, and they were starched to the consistency of origami armour. Folding them was a feat of geometry. One guide actually recommended practicing for some hours daily to perfect the art. Imagine spending your afternoons wrestling with triangles of linen just to prove you were coalesced enough to exist. Even their storage was ritualized. Napkins were kept in custom napkin rings engraved with guests' initials, not for hygiene, but to make sure nobody accidentally touched someone else's cloth, because in Victorian morality, there were few things more scandalous than a napkin that had fraternised with the wrong lap. As with all things Victorian, this obsession wasn't about cleanliness or elegance, it was about control. The napkin was a symbol of moral restraint, proof that you could conquer your bodily impulses with fabric. Every tiny rule reinforced the same message. To be respectable was to be visibly uncomfortable at all times. And yet, amid all the starch and anxiety, there's something almost poetic about it. The Victorians tried to turn even the smallest gesture, the act of catching a crumb, into theatre. It was civilization reduced to cloth choreography. So the next time you unfold a napkin and toss it over your lap without thinking, spare a thought for the Victorians, the men and women who risked their reputations every time they dabbed their lips. Because in that world, one careless fold could change everything. The napkin. Proof that in Victorian Britain, even cleaning your face could be mistaken for a marriage proposal. Ah, Victorian romance, the only era in history where falling in love required office supplies. In a society where showing an ankle could trigger mass hysteria, courtship was a bureaucratic ordeal so stiff it could make a tax form blush. Every glance, word and a letter was filed, stamped, and approved by the invisible Committee of Social Propriety. Forget sparks, passion or spontaneity. Victorian flirting was basically paperwork with extra repression. In this world, attraction was not something to be indulged, it was something to be supervised. The heart might have fluttered, but the chaperone was always watching. The average Victorian woman's love life resembled a slow-moving investigation, complete with background checks and tea breaks. A man couldn't simply declare affection, he had to apply for the privilege through several layers of polite bureaucracy. Let's begin with the calling card system, the original dating app. If your dating app required perfect penmanship and aristocratic handwriting, a gentleman wishing to express interest couldn't just drop by. That would have been scandalous. Instead, he left a calling card at the lady's home, a small embossed rectangle bearing his name like a resume for romance. The servant would present it to the mistress of the house, who would decide whether to allow future visits. A folded corner might indicate a personal delivery, while a card left uncreased meant business-like courtesy. Translation: every fold carried emotional data. One wrong crease and you might be demoted from potential suitor to polite acquaintance. If the lady, or more precisely her mother, were approved, an invitation for a supervised visit might follow. Supervised being the key word. The couple could converse for perhaps 15 minutes, under the benevolent gaze of an older relative who pretended to read, but was in fact running an internal scandal risk assessment. The conversation itself was a minefield of politeness. You couldn't compliment her looks, that was improper. You couldn't mention feelings, that was indecent. The best you could do was praise the weather and hope she deciphered your tone as romantically tormented. A well-timed sigh could communicate what paragraphs of prose could not. If all went well, the relationship advanced to the next thrilling stage. Letter writing. Love letters were the heart of Victorian romance, and the spleen and the liver, because they were often painfully long. Weeks, even months, could pass between exchanges. Every word was carefully measured, every comma debated, every sentence constructed to say, "I adore you," without ever admitting it outright. A typical letter might read, The weather remains fair. I find myself often contemplating the warmth of the sun upon the garden wall. Translation: I'm in love with you so badly it's affecting my vitamin D levels. The postal service became a lifeline for the repressed. Some lovers sent 2 or 3 letters a day, each slightly more daring than the last, meaning one might include the word affection. But even this passion had to pass through a filter of propriety. Letters were sometimes inspected by family members, so declarations of love came disguised as literary commentary. I found the heroine of Wuthering Heights quite relatable. Really meant, I want to run away with you, but society won't let me. And heaven help you if your letter fell into the wrong hands. One misplaced envelope could trigger a family scandal, a cancelled engagement, or a duel. There were recorded cases of gentlemen being blackmailed for private correspondence that expressed inappropriate tenderness. Imagine losing your fortune because someone found your note saying, "You looked well in lilac." That was the Victorian version of being cancelled on social media. Physical affection, of course, was practically illegal. A man might be permitted to escort a lady to her carriage, but the exchange of hands was considered a moment of high drama. Gloves were often worn during such interactions to preserve not just modesty, but plausible deniability. It wasn't really a touch if there was leather involved, right? When genuine contact did occur, a brush of fingers, a shared book, the accidental exchange of a dropped handkerchief, entire novels of longing were built on it. Victorian romance thrived on micro-interactions that would today barely qualify as acquaintance-level awareness. Chaperones, meanwhile, were the unsung villains of this story, professional romance repellents. Mothers, aunts, and older sisters were tasked with ensuring no emotional contagion occurred. They sat like statues at every meeting, interrupting just when tension began to build. If a conversation grew too animated, they'd cough meaningfully or comment about the tea. Many young couples learned to flirt through subtext simply because direct communication was chaperone-proofed. Courtship events like garden parties, church picnics, or afternoon teas offered rare opportunities for genuine connection, if one could manage it between the hymns and the cucumber sandwiches. At balls, dance cards became the Tinder profiles of their day. A lady's dance card listed the men she'd promised to waltz with, and being omitted was the social equivalent of a ghosting. Of course, any romantic conversation had to happen while twirling under chandeliers, breathless, dizzy, and still monitored by half of London. Proposals themselves were formal, terrifying affairs. A man might ask permission from the father before even approaching the woman. Romantic spontaneity was so restricted that many proposals were delivered by letter, because written ink was considered less compromising than spoken emotion. Imagine proposing marriage in your best cursive, waiting 2 weeks, and then receiving a polite note back saying, "Mother advises against it." And yet, within this oppressive maze of decorum, something strange happened. Passion adapted. Denied physical or emotional freedom, Victorians became masters of subtlety. A shared book of poetry, a coded phrase in a letter, a pressed flower between pages, these became the language of defiance. Every rule they broke, no matter how small, carried the thrill of rebellion. Love existed, not despite the repressions, but because of it. It was the one thing powerful enough to survive the suffocating layers of lace and judgment. Still, the absurdity is undeniable. To modern ears, it sounds exhausting, like trying to flirt in Morse code while being graded for penmanship. But to the Victorians, this was romance at its highest form. Patient, respectable, and meticulously inconvenient. Because in a world where propriety was everything, love had to be hidden behind decorum. It had to whisper through lace fans and linger in ink. It had to exist quietly or not at all. Victorian flirting didn't spark fires. It filled out forms in triplicate and waited 6 to 8 weeks for approval. In modern times, good posture means standing up straight to avoid back pain. In the Victorian era, it meant standing up straight to avoid eternal damnation. According to 19th century etiquette manuals, a crooked spine was a crooked soul, and if your shoulders slumped, so did your moral character. Victorians believed posture wasn't just about looking good, It was about proving that civilization itself had settled nicely into your vertebrae. Because if your spine wasn't shaped like a question mark, were you even polite? For both men and women, posture was a public performance, an elaborate act of bodily restraint meant to announce I am too refined to bend like a peasant. Sitting incorrectly wasn't merely lazy, it was a class betrayal. Uprightness equalled virtue, slouching equalled sin. So naturally, the Victorians invented an entire industry dedicated to keeping people in pain for the sake of appearances. Let's begin with the most notorious instrument of posture correction, the corset. To the Victorians, this wasn't underwear, it was an ironclad moral compass. A tightly laced waist meant discipline, purity and elegance. Breathing, however, was optional. Fashion magazines called it graceful constraint. Doctors called it internal rearrangement. Women called it Tuesday. Corsets were tightened until ribs creaked like old floorboards. Waist measurements became competitive. 16 inches was ideal, 14 was legendary. And anything above 18 was considered a personal failing. Mothers and governesses laced young girls as early as age 10, teaching them that pain was simply the sound of manners settling in. And of course, posture was the corset's proudest achievement. The device forced the back into a rigid arc, the shoulders back and the chest forward, the perfect silhouette of artificial dignity. Women didn't just wear corsets, they lived inside them hour after breathless hour. Fainting couches, those long, elegant pieces of furniture, weren't just decorative. They were emergency landing pads for women who just remembered their lungs existed. But corsets weren't the only torture devices in town. There were posture braces, spine boards, shoulder straps, and even metal neck collars designed to maintain the Grecian ideal. Imagine trying to sip tea while wearing a small polite torture rack, and doing it all with a smile. The obsession extended beyond fashion into literature. Etiquette manuals read like engineering guides to the human body. Titles like The Habits of Good Society and How to Behave Perfectly at All Times, a real one, devoted pages to the sacred geometry of sitting. A young lady must never recline, one advised. Conveys lassitude and moral decay. Another warned that leaning against furniture was a vulgar intimacy between the body and the inanimate. In other words, touching a chair was flirting with perdition. Ladies were expected to sit as though freshly varnished and shoulders aligned, chin level, knees together, hands folded like obedient doves. Men had their own version, the gentleman's upright bearing, which required sitting tall but never rigid, confident but never relaxed. Essentially the physical embodiment of unresolved tension. Even the act of rising from a chair had choreography. You couldn't simply stand up, you had to unfold gracefully, like a dignified piece of origami. A lady's back must remain straight, her expression serene, her movements as smooth as thought itself. Any hint of haste was barbaric. Standing too quickly was practically a confession of moral bankruptcy. But behind all this spinal precision lay something more sinister. Posture as class propaganda. The wealthy could afford to be upright. Their lives required little labour, allowing them to cultivate the luxury of stillness. The poor, on the other hand, were perpetually bent, over sewing machines, coal buckets and factory belts. Their slouched backs became physical proof in elite eyes of their lower nature. Society quite literally divided itself along the lines of curvature. Middle-class families, desperate to distinguish themselves from the working masses, turned posture correction into a national sport. Drawing rooms echoed with the bark of governesses shouting, "Sit straight," like military sergeants of civility. Mothers balanced books on their daughters' heads and rulers down their sons' backs, transforming daily life into a one-child parade of balance and fear. The result? A generation of Victorians who looked magnificent in portraits and walked like freshly assembled marionettes in real life. It wasn't just about class, it was about morality. The straight spine was the visible symbol of a straight conscience. Women were told that posture reflected inner purity. A drooping shoulder was a sign of romantic indulgence. A tilted chin hinted at unwomanly confidence. To sit properly was to declare oneself both decent and domesticated. And yet, the contradiction was deliciously Victorian. Women were expected to appear effortlessly graceful while simultaneously being crushed by the steel boning and the moral expectation. They were supposed to glide like swans, but only because they were physically incapable of bending. Men weren't spared either. A true gentleman's posture revealed authority, composure, and a complete absence of anything resembling emotion. He stood tall, spoke softly, and kept his movements as minimal as his feelings. Any sign of relaxation was interpreted as moral looseness, or worse, an American influence. By the late century, doctors began diagnosing a new epidemic: nervous curvature, essentially posture-induced collapse. Fainting, migraines, digestive issues, even hysteria were attributed to years of compressing the body into moral architecture. But rather than abandon the custom, Victorians simply invented new gadgets: chair braces, posture corsets, even electrotherapy belts to simulate uprightness. The irony, of course, is that all this effort created the illusion of calm in a world vibrating with anxiety. Every drawing room was full of people too polite to breathe deeply. Every parlour was a forest of vertebrae straining under social pressure. So the next time you see a sepia photograph of a Victorian lady, serene and statuesque, remember, she's not relaxed. She's probably counting the seconds until she can lie down without committing a moral offence. Victorian posture proved one thing: you could look perfectly composed while every organ in your torso filed for divorce. Victorian Britain had a lot of rules. There were rules for talking, walking, sitting, and even breathing. But nowhere did their love of regulation reach such magnificent absurdity as in mourning. When death came knocking, Victorians didn't simply cry and move on. They held a 12-act opera of despair, complete with costumes, timetables, and accessories. In short, they didn't just mourn people. They mourned the ability to have fun ever again. It all began with Queen Victoria herself, the undisputed Empress of eternal sadness. When her husband Prince Albert died in 1861, she didn't just grieve, she industrialized it. The Queen spent the next 40 years dressed in black, turning personal heartbreak into national policy. Britain followed her example with morbid enthusiasm. To mourn was no longer a private emotion, it was a public performance of respectability. In the Victorian mind, grief wasn't a feeling, it was an aesthetic. Mourning had to look proper, feel proper, and be conducted with all the joy of a tax audit. Etiquette manuals detailed the process down to the month, the colour, and the thickness of the veil. Failing to mourn correctly could destroy your reputation faster than the death itself. There was a strict schedule of sorrow. A widow, for example, entered a 2-year sentence of fashion exile called deep mourning. During this time, she wore nothing but matte black, no lace, no jewellery, no shimmer of hope. Her wardrobe was made of crepe, a scratchy fabric that looked like despair and felt like punishment. Even laughter was considered a moral failure. Imagine having to apologise for smiling at a sunset because your husband had died 20 months ago. After a year, the widow graduated to second mourning, which allowed for dull grey, lavender, or half-mourning colours, essentially the emotional palette of a fog bank. Only after the full mourning cycle concluded could she wear colour again, at which point she risked scandal anyway. "Oh, Mrs. Pembroke has gone into mauve already," neighbours would whisper, as though she'd started flirting with the undertaker. Men, predictably, got off easy. Their grief came in the form of a black armband, a sort of sadness sleeve, they wore for a few months before returning to business as usual. They could attend dinner parties, go shooting, or remarry by Easter without anyone batting an eye. Women, however, were trapped in fabric purgatory. Society expected them to treat sorrow like a lifelong career. Black became more than a colour, it was a social badge of piety. Entire industries bloomed to support the nation's obsession with deathware. London's crepe emporiums and mourning warehouses sold everything from jet-beaded gloves to black-edge stationery. You could buy mourning parasols, mourning fans, mourning pocket watches, and even mourning underwear, because apparently grief was most sincere when coordinated. For wealthier families, it wasn't just about looking sorrowful, it was about looking expensively sorrowful. Custom-made mourning dresses could cost as much as a year's salary for a servant. Those of lower means did their best to imitate, sometimes dyeing their only dress black in a desperate attempt to appear properly bereaved. The result was a nation dressed for funerals that might never end. Walking down a Victorian street must have felt like wading through a monochrome fashion show where joy was strictly prohibited. The rules extended far beyond clothing. Mourning jewellery became a thriving trade, often incorporating locks of the deceased's hair woven into bracelets or brooches. Sentimental keepsakes, they were called, though one imagines few people today would find comfort in accessorising with Aunt Mildred's follicles. Even photography joined the trend. Post-mortem portraits, eerily lifelike photos of the dead, became cherished mementos. Families proudly displayed these macabre souvenirs in drawing rooms, ensuring guests could sip tea while staring at Uncle Harold's artfully posed corpse. What made Victorian mourning especially excruciating was that grief wasn't optional. It was performative. Failure to follow the mourning code signalled not emotional strength but moral deficiency. Attend the theatre too soon after a relative's death, and tongues would wag. Accept a dance invitation during mourning and you'd be branded heartless. Mourning was essentially the longest, gloomiest job interview of your life, and everyone in your social circle was the hiring manager. Even calling cards reflected bereavement. A mourning card had a thin black border, its thickness corresponding to how recently you'd been struck by tragedy. A narrow line meant distant relative, mild inconvenience. A heavy band meant close family member, do not invite to parties. Entire relationships were navigated through the geometry of grief. The pressure was so immense that some people kept mourning wardrobes ready in advance, because you never knew when death or dinner might strike. Others, tired of the constant expectation, began faking it, wearing old mourning clothes just to appear properly sombre. Nothing says emotional health like pretending to grieve just to avoid gossip. At the heart of all this was Queen Victoria herself, who transformed her private sorrow into an empire-wide lifestyle brand. Her unending mourning for Prince Albert set the tone for a generation. She withdrew from public life, filled her homes with his untouched belongings, and instructed her servants to lay out his clothes daily, as if he might stroll in any moment and comment on the drapes. She practically made sadness fashionable, and the empire followed obediently. For 4 decades, Britain existed under a symbolic rain cloud. Black became the colour of respectability, and cheerfulness became suspect. The nation's emotional tone was so bleak that even Christmas cards started depicting angels and tombstones. When your holiday greetings look like obituaries, it's safe to say grief has gone too far. Of course, where there's emotion, there's enterprise. The mourning industry flourished. Milliners, undertakers, stationers, photographers, perfumers, even florists specialised in mourning arrangements, usually lilies that smelled faintly of despair and mildew. Etiquette experts churned out guidebooks on proper mourning conduct, because what better way to profit from death than to charge people for how to do it correctly? It's almost poetic in a grim way. The Victorians took one of a life's rawest, most unpredictable emotions and buried it under ritual and fabric. Grief became not something to feel, but something to wear. And when the time finally came to step out of black and rejoin the living, many found they couldn't. Decades of mourning had become their identity. They had forgotten what joy felt like, or worse, had learned to mistrust it. Because in the Victorian world, sorrow wasn't a passing shadow, it was a permanent wardrobe. The Victorians didn't just mourn people, they mourned colour, laughter, and the very concept of moving on. If you thought Victorian etiquette ended at the dinner table, think again. It followed people out of their parlours, onto the streets, and straight into the cramped, wheezing heart of modernity, public transport. When the omnibus and train arrived, the Victorians didn't see but progress. They saw a new battlefield of manners, where elbows, eye contact, and bodily functions became moral decisions. Every trip was a masterclass in holding your sneeze for 40 minutes. The Industrial Revolution might have built the engines, but etiquette built the tension. Suddenly, people who had never shared air before were forced to breathe the same recycled fog. The rich, the poor, and the questionably middle were now trapped in the same mobile boxes of social discomfort, a nightmare for a society obsessed with class boundaries. It was as if all of Britain had been shaken up and poured into a carriage together, and no one knew where to look. The omnibus was the great equaliser, in theory. In reality, it was a rolling morality play. Men were expected to leap up the moment a lady appeared, offering their seat with the enthusiasm of a condemned man performing his last good deed. Refusing to do so risked public condemnation. Doing it too eagerly risked suspicion of flirtation. It was a delicate dance of decency made worse by the fact that most omnibuses smelled like damp straw and regret. And what about the women? They had to navigate the perilous landscape of male politeness without appearing forward. Accepting a seat was acceptable, but only if done gracefully, preferably with an air of mild reluctance. Declining a seat might suggest independence, which was nearly as scandalous as murder. A true lady always carried a fan, not just to keep cool, but to erect a portable barrier against unwanted proximity. The fan became the ultimate Victorian force field. Flutter it once, and you communicated, "Don't breathe near me." Meanwhile, everyone else, especially the working class, was just trying to get to work. The etiquette books didn't have much to say about them other than to remind them to keep clean, quiet, and deferential. But this was easier said than done when soot, sweat, and the occasional runaway chicken joined the commute. The upper and middle classes complained endlessly about the odours of industry, as if the very smell of labour were contagious. One etiquette writer even advised carrying a handkerchief perfumed with lavender to shield the senses from vulgarity. Translation: if you can't stand the smell of reality, bring your own air. Then came the railways, those roaring symbols of speed and progress that terrified half the nation and thrilled the other. For the first time, strangers could travel long distances together without exchanging a single word. And that was exactly how the Victorians liked it. Speaking to your fellow passengers was considered wildly inappropriate unless you'd been formally introduced, which you never had because this was England. The result? Silent carriages filled with people pretending they didn't exist. It was a curious kind of torture, a mixture of noise and repression. The train rattled, hissed, and shrieked its way across the countryside while the passengers sat in rigid moral agony. Sneezing was forbidden, coughing was suspicious, snoring was treason. The real challenge wasn't surviving the journey, it was surviving the temptation to clear your throat. Eye contact was another social disaster waiting to happen. A gentleman caught gazing at a lady risked being labelled impertinent. A lady caught gazing back risked being thought bold. Most passengers solved this by staring out the window as though the passing cows held the secrets of the universe. Reading was a popular distraction, provided that the book wasn't too sensational, since the mysteries of London or Dracula might suggest an unhealthy imagination. Seating arrangements were an unspoken hierarchy. The best seats, those furthest from drafts, belonged to the wealthy or well-dressed. The middle classes filled the rest, and the poor stood clutching their parcels, praying for balance. Some trains even had ladies-only compartments, not out of respect, but fear, a societal attempt to prevent unchaperoned mingling that might lead to flirtation or worse, conversation. Etiquette also extended to luggage. Placing your bag where someone else might wish to sit was a sin. Placing it on your lap was virtuous. Dropping it onto someone's foot? A catastrophe that required a minimum of 3 apologies and possibly a written note of contrition. And if you accidentally brushed against someone, you were expected to apologise as though you'd committed a small assault. "Excuse me" became the most overused phrase on the rails, though never delivered above a whisper, lest it draw more attention to the crime. But perhaps the cruelest rule of all was silence. Talking loudly, laughing, or humming was seen as evidence of low breeding. The perfect passenger was invisible, a breathing statue wrapped in tweed and self-restraint. The British stiff upper lip wasn't born in the battlefield. It was perfected in train carriages somewhere between Paddington and Bath. Of course, the more rigid the rules, the more likely they were to be broken, often unintentionally. There are delightful reports of passengers fainting from the heat but apologising for the inconvenience. One gentleman reportedly fell asleep on a lady's shoulder, woke mortified, and offered to change carriages entirely. She declined, saying, "It was quite unavoidable, sir," which was Victorian for, "Don't ever speak of this again until the sun dies." And yet, beneath all the awkwardness, the rails represented something revolutionary: mobility. For the first time, ordinary people could travel beyond their towns, glimpse new worlds, and momentarily forget the iron cages of class. The irony, of course, was that they brought those cages with them, in the form of manners, posture, and the eternal fear of sneezing in public. By the end of the century, trains and omnibuses had become the stage where British politeness met industrial chaos. They were microcosms of society, loud, crowded, and full of people pretending everything was fine. The journey itself didn't just connect cities, it connected everyone's shared suffering in the name of civility. Because in Victorian Britain, even the act of travelling wasn't about getting somewhere. It was about not offending anyone while you did it. Every trip was a silent opera of self-restraint, where social survival depended on stillness, and every sigh risked scandal. The world was speeding up, but the Victorians were holding their breath. Literally. They called it progress, but really, it was just 40 miles of polite suffocation. In Victorian Britain, even saying hello could ruin your life. A greeting wasn't a simple exchange of friendliness. It was a diplomatic operation disguised as a social nicety. Who bowed first, who shook hands, who dared to misjudge either. Every movement was charged with risk. Victorian greetings were less about warmth and more about survival of the most awkward. To the Victorians, the handshake was never casual. It was a coded gesture that announced your class, your character, and your general worth as a human being. Extend your hand at the wrong time and you might as well have slapped someone with it. Failing to extend it when appropriate, social exile. There were no universal rules, only an endless series of invisible hierarchies, and naturally, everyone pretended to know them. The key rule was simple but cruel: never initiate a greeting with someone above your station. It was always the superior, in gender, class, or title, who set the tone. A gentleman could not approach a lady first, a shop clerk could not greet his employer, and heaven forbid a servant greeted anyone at all. The higher-ranked person was the conductor, and everyone else waited for their social cue like anxious violinists. A lady bows to none, one etiquette guide explained, but may acknowledge a gentleman's salute. Translation: if you were male, you were forever guessing whether to nod, bow, or simply evaporate. For the working classes, greetings were practical. They waved, they called out, they grinned, things Victorians considered dangerously close to happiness. Among the genteel, however, greetings were solemn rituals. A bow had to be measured. Too deep and you seemed obsequious. Too shallow and you risked insult. A gentleman must incline his head slightly, but never with enthusiasm, warned one manual. Imagine trying to appear humble while pretending to have no neck. Then there was the handshake itself, that fragile bridge between propriety and personal space. In early Victorian society, handshakes weren't even considered polite among the upper classes. They were for businessmen, soldiers, or Americans, and therefore suspicious. True ladies and gentlemen bowed or curtsied. But as the middle class rose in power, the handshake began its long campaign toward respectability. Unfortunately, this only made things worse, because now not only did you have to shake hands, you had to do it correctly. The proper handshake was firm but not forceful, brief but not abrupt. The palm should meet the others gently, no lingering, no pumping, no audible sound. Shaking too long could suggest intimacy. Shaking too hard could suggest ambition. A limp handshake, however, was considered morally weak. a mark of feeble will and disordered nerves, as one critic sniffed. You had to strike the perfect balance, assertive enough to prove your existence, restrained enough to make people question whether they imagined it. And then came the nightmare of timing. Picture two Victorians approaching one another on a foggy street, both performing complex internal calculations. Who outranks whom? Who greets first? Who bows lower? Who risks eternal shame by moving a fraction too soon? Half of London's social tension came from people frozen mid-bow, waiting for confirmation that the other person was indeed someone worth acknowledging. Eye contact was the detonator. Once made, the ritual had to proceed flawlessly or end in polite catastrophe. The danger was even greater in mixed company. Between men and women, greetings were practically negotiations. A man could only bow until the lady offered her hand, a gesture that could take years, sometimes literally. A handshake between unmarried people of opposite sexes bordered on scandal. If it happened, it was spoken of in hushed tones. She gave him her hand, meaning either deep trust or an unforgivable lapse in judgment. It was emotional theatre disguised as etiquette. And heaven help you if you ran into someone in public and didn't recognise them quickly enough. To fail to greet an acquaintance could be mistaken for deliberate snubbing. London drawing rooms were full of whispered feuds that began with missed nods. She looked directly at me and did not bow, someone might hiss at tea, as if describing a murder. There were even reported cases of people sending apology letters for greeting too enthusiastically. Pray forgive my excessive cordiality yesterday at the park. The entire empire was one step away from requiring permits to smile. Among men, greetings carried their own hazards. A gentleman's handshake was a test of character, especially in business. It was said that a firm, dry handshake meant honesty, while a sweaty or hesitant one meant deceit. Industrialists and politicians mastered the art of gripping just long enough to convey moral superiority without acknowledging emotion. There were guides on how to stand while greeting, 1 foot slightly forward, chin level, eyes modestly lowered, as if preparing for a duel fought entirely with wrists. Royal and aristocratic greetings were another dimension altogether. Bowing to royalty was an art form with no margin for error. The proper bow to the Queen involved a precise angle, a momentary gaze, and the subtle suggestion that you might faint from respect. If you straightened up too soon, you risked committing what one observer called a democratic blunder. If you hesitated too long, it looked like you'd forgotten how gravity works. Meeting royalty was less about reverence and more about balance control. Yet for all this absurdity, greetings mattered deeply. They were the first act of social theatre, the handshake before the handshake of the conversation. To greet correctly was to declare yourself civilized. To greet poorly was to confirm everyone's worst suspicions about your breeding. The Victorians built an entire hierarchy out of gestures that lasted mere seconds. By the end of the century, etiquette manuals began to admit the obvious, that the obsession with greeting rituals had gone too far. Some satirists mocked it outright, suggesting that people would soon require tutors just to nod. Yet the fear never disappeared. Even in the simplest good afternoon, Victorians carried generations of anxiety about rank, virtue, and whether their bow looked appropriately miserable. Because in a world where appearances ruled everything, the first impression wasn't just important, it was destiny. One mistimed greeting could close every door before you even reached for the handle. Victorian greetings weren't about connection, they were about surviving a 3-second performance review. Victorian Britain wasn't just the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, it was also the birthplace of industrialized politeness. Manners became a booming business, a full-blown commercial empire dedicated to manufacturing refinement for the masses. Every bow, every handshake, every spoon angle could now be taught, sold and monetized. In a society terrified of doing the wrong thing, etiquette was the hottest product on the market. Why have a personality when you could just rent one from a manners guide? As the century rolled on, the middle class exploded in size, and with it came an epidemic of social insecurity. Factories might have made their fortunes, but factories didn't teach you how to address a baron or where to look during dinner. The newly rich needed polish, and the Victorians were all too eager to sell it. A polite society was a profitable one, and the world of commerce responded with a velvet-gloved frenzy. Enter the etiquette manual, the 19th century equivalent of a self-help bestseller. These books promised to transform rough-edge merchants and their anxious wives into paragons of grace. Titles like The Gentleman's Book of Etiquette, The Habits of Good Society, and How to Behave. A pocket manual of etiquette and deportment flew off shelves faster than penny dreadfuls. Each page offered salvation through posture, diction, and the proper use of lace gloves. Readers were told exactly how to enter a room, how to greet a duchess, and even how long to hold eye contact before collapsing into shame. The tone of these manuals was always reassuringly condescending. They spoke to readers like benevolent drill sergeants of civility. Never cough in conversation. It displays vulgar health. Avoid gesticulation. It belongs to nations without moral restraint. Do not speak too much of yourself, unless you are someone worth hearing about. The message was clear. Being likeable was a skill, and you were probably doing it wrong. And so a manners industry was born, complete with schools, tutors, and professional deportment instructors ready to sculpt the rising middle class into obedient facsimiles of the elite. London's finishing schools for young ladies became assembly lines of artificial grace. Girls were trained to walk in straight lines with books balanced on their heads, to pour tea without making eye contact, and to play the piano pleasantly but not passionately. The goal wasn't to express personality, it was to erase it. Deportment masters for men were equally merciless. A gentleman in training was taught how to stand as though carved from marble, to gesture with moderation, and to laugh only when socially sanctioned. Manuals insisted that a true gentleman's hands should never hang idly. They should hover in polite readiness, as if waiting to rescue a fainting dowager. The upper classes didn't want charm, they wanted choreography. These refinement factories operated with almost religious zeal. Some finishing schools even kept mirrors lining the walls so pupils could monitor their own posture, a Victorian precursor to the surveillance state. Students graduated with the ability to bow, curtsy, and smile on command, having learned that self-expression was something best outsourced to etiquette. And the cost of all this civility? Substantial. A full course in deportment could drain a middle-class income. But parents saw it as an investment, a ticket to social legitimacy. Good manners were the new currency, and those without them were bankrupt, no matter how much gold jingled in their pockets. The rich, meanwhile, bought newer manners just to stay ahead. When the middle class learned one code of conduct, the aristocracy simply invented another. It was class warfare conducted through cutlery. Magazines joined the frenzy, columns like Hints for the Home and What Society Requires published weekly updates on the shifting rules of respectability. Readers learned which calling cards were in fashion and which shades of black were acceptable for mourning in May. The middle classes read these with trembling pencils, annotating margins like they were studying for an exam on existing correctly. You weren't just expected to behave, you were expected to behave fashionably. Even advertising got in on the act. Soap companies marketed cleanliness as a moral obligation. Toothpaste promised not just white teeth, but social salvation. A lady's smile, one had boasted, is her most valuable introduction. Etiquette had fused with consumerism. Virtue could now be purchased in a jar. Every object, from gloves to hats to handkerchiefs, came preloaded with behavioural expectations. A clean collar wasn't just hygiene, it was social proof. And then came the public lectures. Travelling etiquette experts packed halls across Britain, lecturing anxious audiences about table manners and tone of voice. These were half sermon, half performance, complete with demonstrations of how not to sit, stand, or speak. One lecturer even carried a folding chair on stage solely to show people how to occupy it without moral collapse. The audience, presumably, took notes on how to avoid future disgrace. But perhaps the greatest irony of all was that the entire empire of manners was built on fear. The Victorians weren't obsessed with politeness because they loved rules. They were obsessed because they dreaded humiliation. In a world obsessed with appearances, respectability became a kind of armour, one you had to keep polished at all times. Etiquette was marketed as freedom but practiced as self-censorship. You could ascend socially, as long as you followed every script, every gesture, and every unspoken law of decorum. And while the manuals claimed to teach morality, what they really sold was mimicry. You didn't learn to be good, you learned to look good. The polite smile, the measured bow, the delicate cough, these were not signs of virtue, but camouflage for ambition. A merchant could become a gentleman, a housemaid could pass for a lady's companion, and a society that prized authenticity ended up mass-producing artificial people. By the dawn of the 20th century, the etiquette industry had done its job so well that manners themselves became mechanical. People moved, spoke, and even suffered according to published instructions. Refinement had gone retail. And behind every polite, "How do you do?" lurked a library's worth of manuals reminding you that however you did it, you were probably doing it wrong. Victorian politeness wasn't born, it was marketed, packaged and sold by the pound. Who needs charm when you can buy conformity wholesale? Victorian servants lived in a world where politeness wasn't a virtue, it was a survival strategy. The very people who kept Britain's households running were also the ones required to act as if they didn't exist. They polished the silver, scrubbed the floors, served the meals, dressed the lords and ladies, and were expected to do it all silently, invisibly, and with absolute grace. It wasn't enough to work hard, or one had to vanish beautifully. If the butler sneezed, somewhere an aristocrat's monocle shattered. The great irony of Victorian etiquette was that it depended entirely on people who weren't allowed to have any. For the upper and middle classes, manners were about refinement and restraint. For servants, manners were about obedience and survival. Their every movement was governed by an unwritten constitution of politeness that no one ever explained, but everyone expected them to know by heart. They weren't just employees, they were living scenery in the theatre of gentility. In grand houses, servants were expected to appear everywhere and nowhere at once. A good servant was a ghost with impeccable posture. They entered rooms only when summoned, spoke only when addressed, and moved so quietly that guests sometimes doubted their existence. Manuals for house management advised that servants should perform duties as though by invisible agency. Translation: make the house function perfectly, but heaven help you if anyone actually sees you doing it. And they did it all under crushing hierarchies. At the top stood the butler, master of the household's dignity, followed by the housekeeper, keeper of moral order among the staff. Below them were footmen, maids, cooks, valets, grooms, and the eternally exhausted scullery maids, each bound by rank and ritual. The butler's voice was low and measured, his manner solemn, his timing divine. He knew precisely when to open a door, when to pour wine, and when to pretend not to hear aristocrats gossiping about bankruptcy. A good butler had the emotional range of a marble statue, unless the roast was late, in which case he might briefly blink. For female servants, life was even more brutal. Housemaids rose before dawn to stoke fires, polish grates, and haul buckets of coal, yet they were expected to appear neat and fresh-faced when the family awoke, as if soot and sleep deprivation were mere character flaws. Ladies' maids were trapped in a nightmare of intimacy and distance, expected to know every secret of their mistress's wardrobe but none of her thoughts. A wrinkled hem could cost them their job, a misplaced opinion could cost them their character. Silence was sacred. Servants weren't allowed to make noise, not when walking, working, or even existing. Many houses had separate staircases, known as servants' passages, designed to keep them unseen. A servant crossing the main hall at the wrong moment could cause social embarrassment on a cosmic scale. Guests might faint. Reputation might crumble. The sun itself might refuse to rise. So they crept, they tiptoed, they rehearsed invisibility until it became second nature. Even coughing was regulated. Never in the presence of the family, warned one guide, as if lungs themselves were impertinent. And then there was the language of service. Servants spoke in carefully measured tones, always deferential, never familiar. They referred to employers as Sir or My Lady, never daring to meet their eyes unless invited. Politeness became a form of self-erasure. You could work in a household for 20 years and still be addressed as though you'd just wandered in from the street. Familiarity was not just frowned upon, it was a firing offence. One misplaced good morning at the wrong level of enthusiasm could end your employment before breakfast. Even emotions had to be disguised. Servants weren't allowed anger, sorrow, or joy. They could not laugh too loudly, sigh too heavily, or frown too visibly. Their composure had to be constant, no matter what chaos brewed around them. A servant could be starving, ill, or heartbroken, yet still required to smile politely as they polished the silverware. Compassion was to be given, never received. Mealtimes highlighted this cruel paradox perfectly. While the family dined upstairs on roast pheasant and syllabub, servants ate hastily in the basement, often in shifts, with whatever scraps remained. And yet even here etiquette persisted. The servants' hall mirrored the hierarchy above. The butler sat at the head of the table, the scullery maid at the foot. Deference flowed downhill like bad gravy. Even poverty, it seemed, demanded politeness. Servant etiquette manuals, yes, there were manuals for servants too, drilled home the same message: humility, discretion, and gratitude for one's position. Remember your place and you will keep it, advised one particularly bleak edition. Obedience wasn't just expected, it was moralised. A cheerful servant was a good servant, no matter how grim the conditions. Kindness was optional. Perfection was mandatory. For all their invisibility, however, servants saw everything. They overheard affairs, debts, and scandals that could ruin entire families, and their silence kept the social order intact. In some ways, they were the true gatekeepers of Victorian morality, upholding reputations through sheer discretion. A butler might know every skeleton in his master's closet, both literal and metaphorical, but he'd never breathe a word. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was too well trained to admit he had lungs. Of course, the stress of such constant restraint took its toll. Servants often worked 18-hour days for meagre wages, sleeping in windowless rooms below stairs, their lives measured by the rhythm of bells. The average domestic servant's career lasted only a few years before exhaustion, illness, or rebellion took over. Yet to the world above, they remained symbols of virtue, the living proof that England ran on order, discipline, and clean silver. The system depended on them, yet denied them humanity. The aristocracy's elegance, the middle class's aspirations, all rested on the backs of people forbidden to exist in the light. They were ghosts in livery, condemned to serve a politeness they could never afford, and still they perfected it. The bow at the door, the smooth glide of a tray, the whisper of fabric against silence. It was all performance, all mastery. In a world obsessed with etiquette, the servants were the true professionals. Because in Victorian Britain, the upper classes had the manners, but the servants had the precision. If the butler sneezed, somewhere an aristocrat's monocle shattered, and the maid was blamed for it. To be a woman in Victorian Britain was to live as a decorative miracle of restraint, a creature of elegance, silence, and strategic oxygen deprivation. Every breath, every glance, every syllable was subject to inspection. Men ruled the laws, but women enforced the unspoken ones: how to sit, smile, faint, and exist without betraying that you were, in fact, human. The empire ran on coal and hypocrisy, and women were expected to burn quietly. A Victorian lady's lungs were decorative, not functional. From birth, a girl was trained not in intellect but in impression management. The goal was to become a masterpiece of control, a painting come to life, forever still yet endlessly admired. She was taught to glide rather than walk, to speak softly enough that her sentences seemed imported from heaven, and to smile like someone who'd just agreed to marry a man chosen by her aunt. A woman's success was measured not by her achievements, but by how convincingly she could appear effortless while living under constant supervision. The commandment, never speak first, was sacred. A lady who initiated conversation risked being labelled forward, which was Victorian for possibly possessed by the devil. Even laughter had to be moderated. A polite tinkle was charming, a hearty laugh was ruinous. A good woman's voice was to sound like music from another room, pleasant, indistinct, and ideally muffled by wallpaper. It wasn't that women had nothing to say, it was that society believed their opinions were best enjoyed in theory. Then there was the cult of grace. Grace wasn't something you had, it was something you performed. You had to sit gracefully, move gracefully, and in moments of physical collapse, faint gracefully. Yes, fainting, the national pastime of Victorian womanhood. Whether from tight corsets, bad ventilation, or sheer exhaustion from pretending to be delicate, women were expected to swoon like collapsing poetry. A faint, when done correctly, was practically a social achievement. The trick was to fall elegantly, without exposing an ankle or expressing the will to live. A clumsy feint was worse than no feint at all. How gauche to lose consciousness without style. Sweating, meanwhile, was absolutely forbidden. The female body was supposed to exist without evidence of effort. A woman could spend an hour climbing a staircase in 20 pounds of fabric, but she must emerge looking serene, as though propelled by divine air currents. Perspiration was vulgar, proof that one possessed working organs, an indecency best left to men, horses, and the working class. Society adored pale, fragile women because they made weakness fashionable. Strength was masculine, delicacy was desirable. The ideal woman looked moments on from death, but beautifully so. Fashion, of course, enforced this tyranny. Corsets crushed ribs into submission, while skirts expanded to the circumference of furniture. Layers of petticoats turned every outing into a slow-motion wrestling match with fabric. Parasols shielded her complexions from sunlight. Gloves protected hands from the horror of contact. And bonnets framed faces like halos for the domesticated saints they were expected to be. The message was clear. A woman's role was not to live, but to pose. Even leisure came with its own chains. Horseback riding, side saddle only, because control mattered more than comfort. Walking, only with small, deliberate steps, lest the lower classes mistake you for one of them. Dancing, acceptable, but only within strict boundaries of modesty. One misstep and you weren't a dancer, you were a scandal. Athleticism was unthinkable. Climbing a hill or running for a carriage could cause gossip, which was infinitely worse than cardiac arrest. The social pressure extended to emotions too. Anger was unfeminine, ambition unbecoming, and enthusiasm practically criminal. A lady could display sadness if it was elegant, or joy if it was restrained, but passion, of any kind, was a sign of spiritual disorder. Etiquette writers assured women that their power lay in gentle influence, which translated roughly to make everything happen while pretending you didn't. They were told to manage men's moods, soothe egos, and mediate social disasters, all while maintaining the composure of a heavily sedated angel. Marriage only emulsified the act. Once wed, a woman became a symbol of her husband's taste, morality, and bank balance. Her behaviour reflected on his reputation. Her silence reflected even better. Wives were expected to remain cheerful in public and invisible in private, presiding over domestic order with the precision of a saint who'd given up hope of heaven. A discontented wife was a social failure. A happy one was a myth circulated by etiquette manuals. Even intellect had to be disguised. A woman could read, but not too much, lest she appear bookish. She could play the piano, but not too well, or she'd look professional, which was vulgar. The perfect woman was clever enough to converse, but never to correct. The only acceptable intelligence was the kind that stayed neatly folded between compliments and embroidery. Knowledge was like perfume, pleasant in small doses, suffocating if applied with confidence, and yet within these suffocating constraints, women found small rebellions. Some used fainting as strategy, collapsing at just the right moment to end an awkward dinner or gain sympathy from a suitor. Others turned the art of conversation into coded resistance, weaving sarcasm into politeness so deftly that men mistook mockery for modesty. A few even began to question the absurdity of it all. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and later the suffragettes would chip away at the facade, but for most of the century, femininity remained a performance choreographed by fear. Still, there's no denying the brilliance of their endurance. They survived a world that demanded perfection from bodies barely able to breathe. They smiled through pain, glided through fatigue, and managed to hold together a civilization powered entirely by their unpaid emotional labour. The empire may have been ruled by men, but it was balanced precariously on the tight-laced torsos of women who were expected to do everything gracefully. Victorian grace, in the end, was not about beauty at all. It was about control, the body, the voice, the soul itself, bound into shapes that pleased others. Women weren't just taught to behave, they were sculpted into submission, piece by delicate piece. Because in this society, womanhood wasn't something you were born into. It was something you performed until you forgot where the act ended, and you began. Victorian women mastered elegance under pressure, mostly because the corset left them no choice. If Victorian women were corseted into submission, Victorian men were strangled by their own neckties. The gentlemen of the 19th century were trapped in a different kind of cage, one lined with waistcoats, expectations, and chronic repression. They were told to be pillars of combusia, paragons of self-control and statues of moral fortitude. Unfortunately, statues don't breathe, laugh, or feel. Victorian men didn't express feelings, they just developed ulcers instead. From the moment a boy learned to button his first stiff collar, he was being moulded into an ideal, the gentleman. Not the ordinary mortal kind, but the mythological version found in etiquette manuals and sermons. Perfectly calm, immaculately dressed, and emotionally flatter than the wallpaper. Trained not to cry, not to argue, and certainly not to feel too much of anything. Emotion, after all, was the slippery slope to chaos, and chaos belonged to the French, the poets, and women. A gentleman's first duty was composure. He could be furious, heartbroken, or terrified, but heaven forbid he let it show. Stoicism was his armour, silence his weapon. If a man lost his temper, it wasn't seen as passion, it was proof of bad breeding. A truly refined man would rather die of internalised rage than raise his voice in public, and many did. The British Empire might have been built on iron and an industry, but its emotional foundation was bottled up anxiety. Dress only deepened the imprisonment. Each layer of fabric was a moral statement. The waistcoat, the cravat, the frock coat, all reminders that being male meant being perpetually uncomfortable in expensive fabric. Black suits became the unofficial uniform of restraint, sober, dignified, and slightly funereal, as if all men were attending the funeral of their own personalities. Even facial hair followed moral trends. A clean-shaven man was respectable. A man with a flamboyant moustache risked being labelled continental. No horror was greater than appearing too expressive, even with follicles. In conversation, men suffered their own brand of torment. A gentleman could not interrupt, boast, or, most terrifyingly, reveal ignorance. The result was endless dialogues of polite nonsense, punctuated by nervous coughs and top-hat adjustments. Emotion was filtered through the understatement. A bit of a bother might mean existential despair. Rather trying weather could translate to the collapse of my entire world view. Feelings were compressed into dry phrases until they evaporated completely. And yet, beneath that marble calm, the pressure built. A gentleman's daily life was a war between desire and decorum. Friendships were formal, affection was awkward, and grief was endured like indigestion. Fathers didn't hug their sons, they shook their hands. If the boy had done something exceptional like survive another year at school, romantic emotion was no easier. Victorian men weren't supposed to court with warmth, they were expected to apply for affection in writing like a mortgage. Love was conducted with stoic reverence, passion confined to poetry, preferably written by someone else. Public behaviour was governed by unwritten laws of dignity. A man must walk with confidence but not swagger, greet warmly but not too warmly, drink but never appear drunk. He had to master dueling politeness, that peculiar ritual in which two men insisted on the other going first until both missed the opportunity entirely. At doors, stairways or carriage steps, this genteel standoff could last minutes. It wasn't about kindness, it was about dominance disguised as courtesy. The true victor was the one who appeared least invested in winning. The professional world was equally suffocating. Offices, clubs and parlours were laboratories of repression. Men discussed trade, politics and the weather, never their marriages, children or fears. Vulnerability was a scandal waiting to happen. Even illness had to be understated. The ideal gentleman could be coughing up blood, but would insist, just a touch of the damp old boy. Medicine might have cured the body, but etiquette demanded silence until the autopsy. Leisure offered no relief. Sporting clubs and smoking rooms promised relaxation, but delivered competition in the form of politeness. Every gesture was a test of refinement. A man who puffed his cigar too vigorously was vulgar. One who puffed too little was weak. Drinking was encouraged, but drunkenness was social suicide. Card games and billiards required composure even in defeat, particularly when losing one's week's wages to a duke with a better poker face. And at every turn, conversation circled safely around neutral topics, because emotion, real, messy emotion, was a luxury no gentleman could afford. At home, men faced another kind of expectation, paternal performance. They were the undisputed heads of households, theoretically. In reality, their wives managed everything emotional, domestic, and logistical. The husband's primary duty was to appear commanding, even while being gently outmanoeuvred by a woman half his size. He sat at the head of the table like a weary general, surrounded by children who addressed him as if he were a visiting dignitary. Parenting, like everything else, was conducted at arm's length. Discipline replaced affection. Distance replaced warmth. The result was a nation of emotionally constipated patriarchs raising sons who would grow up to repeat the same performance. And yet, there was a strange pride in it all. Restraint was the British brand. The Empire's confidence, its calm diplomacy, its moral superiority, all stemmed from this belief that emotions were unmanly. Passion was for foreigners, tears for women, and happiness for people without mortgages. Men were taught to repress everything except duty, and they wore their repression like a medal. The stiffer your collar, the stronger your character. But the cost was enormous. Behind those polite smiles and perfectly polished boots lurked generations of unspoken misery. Letters, diaries, and the occasional breakdown revealed what public life concealed. Loneliness, exhaustion, and the crushing pressure of performance. A man could rule colonies and still fear the judgment of his dinner guests. By the end of the century, cracks began to show. Literature and psychology, those scandalous modern inventions, started whispering that maybe feelings weren't moral defects. But for most of the Victorian age, men clung to their restraint as though politeness itself held the empire together. And perhaps, in a way, it did. For a civilization obsessed with dignity, the sight of a gentleman suffering momently was the ultimate symbol of control. Because in the Victorian world, masculinity wasn't measured by power, intelligence, or kindness. It was measured by how convincingly you could endure everything without blinking. Victorian men didn't express feelings. They just developed ulcers, smoked about them, and called it leadership. Victorian children didn't grow up. They were assembled. From the moment they could stand upright without assistance, they were fitted into society's tiniest moral straitjackets. Childhood wasn't a phase of curiosity or joy. It was a probationary period for future respectability. The goal wasn't to raise happy kids. It was to manufacture polite, miniature adults who could sit still long enough to convince visitors that the family had breeding. Childhood was less about toys and more about trauma in a sailor suit. The first thing drilled into a Victorian child wasn't the alphabet, it was deference. A child spoke only when spoken to, and even then, with rehearsed precision. "Yes, father." "No, mother." "Thank you, Aunt Mildred." Any deviation was treated as evidence of moral rot. Laughter had to be stifled, curiosity restrained, and joy rationed like sugar. A noisy child was a public embarrassment, a moral scandal wrapped in short trousers. The smaller you were, the more responsibility you had to seem invisible. Politeness wasn't just encouraged, it was weaponized. Manuals for proper child conduct, yes, they existed, advised that children should cultivate a serene quietness of manner and a subdued voice befitting youth. If you were exuberant, you were insolent. If you were playful, you were vulgar. A perfect Victorian child could attend a 3-hour dinner party without speaking above a whisper or fainting into the soup. In essence, they were trained not to live, but to audition for adulthood. Discipline enforced the illusion. The Victorian home was a temple of obedience, and the father its resident deity. Corporal punishment wasn't taboo, it was Tuesday. The phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" wasn't metaphorical. It was a scheduling guideline. Children were caned, lectured, and occasionally locked in cupboards, all in the name of producing citizens who wouldn't slouch in church. A good child didn't just obey, they obeyed gracefully. Crying was discouraged because it hinted at self-pity. Gratitude, however, was mandatory, even for punishments. "You'll thank me one day," parents said, which was the Victorian equivalent of a horror prophecy. Schools took this philosophy and industrialized it. Education for the young was part academics, part etiquette factory. Boys at boarding schools were trained to recite Latin, endure bullying, and never display emotion, the holy trinity of character building. Girls' schools, meanwhile, specialized in turning curiosity into caution. Lessons included music, needlework, posture, and moral science, not to be confused with actual science, which was considered too stimulating for the female mind. Even recess was regulated. Laughter in excess was deemed unladylike, and climbing trees was practically an act of revolution. The physical expectations were no kinder. Posture, as always, was a national obsession. Children were made to balance books on their heads, sit with ramrod spines, and bow perfectly before elders. A slouching child brought disgrace not only upon themselves, but upon the entire lineage. Little boys were dressed like naval officers in sailor suits, a tradition that made them look perpetually ready for deployment in the battle against joy. Girls were trussed up in frilly dresses and lace gloves, their every movement slowed by the gravitational pull of propriety. Childhood wasn't freedom, it was fashion rehearsal for adulthood. Playtime, when allowed, was never truly carefree. Toys were meant to instruct, not entertain. Dolls taught girls motherhood, and toy soldiers taught boys imperialism. Building blocks encouraged orderly minds, not imagination. And forget about getting dirty, mud was the natural enemy of respectability. Outdoor games were fine only if conducted without shouting, running too fast, or appearing to enjoy oneself. One etiquette guide even warned that unseemly enthusiasm in sport leads to coarse habits. Translation: childhood fun was a gateway drug to working-class behaviour. Even affection had boundaries. Parents weren't supposed to dote on their children, it risked spoiling them. Emotional restraint began early. Hugs were rare, compliments rarer. A child might receive a pat on the head once a year if they'd been exceptionally obedient and quiet during family prayers. Love, in the Victorian household, was expressed through structure, discipline, and the occasional nod of approval over breakfast. And heaven forbid a child expressed affection first. That was presumptuous. Religion added another layer of terror. Sunday school lessons reminded children that God saw everything, even untidy handwriting or the unholy act of giggling during hymns. Hellfire loomed large in the imagination of every 5-year-old who dared to question authority. Salvation, it seemed, depended on polished shoes and perfect posture. By the time children grew up, guilt had already taken root so deeply it flowered into adulthood with grim efficiency. The wealthier families, of course, outsourced much of this repression to governesses, those eternally tragic figures caught between family and staff. They were tasked with raising polite prodigies while never forgetting their own inferiority. Governesses enforced the rules with mechanical precision, straight backs, calm voices, an endless repetition of, "No, dear, not that way." They were educators, therapists, and prison wardens rolled into one. Poor children, meanwhile, faced a harsher version of the same script. Working-class kids were expected to enter labour early, but even there, moralists insisted on manners. Cleanliness and courtesy, reformers declared, are the first steps out of poverty. Imagine being 12 mining coal and worrying about the correct way to address your foreman. The result of all this was a generation of prematurely aged children, tiny adults in moral training wheels. Childhood wasn't a time to explore who you were, it was a time to rehearse who you were expected to become. To be seen and not heard was the golden rule, a phrase that might as well have been carved over every nursery door, and yet beneath all the starched collars and moral lectures, there were cracks in the facade. Some children rebelled in small ways, sneaking a laugh, climbing a fence, stealing a forbidden biscuit. Those moments of disobedience, fleeting, glorious, utterly human, were the only real signs of life in a culture determined to iron out individuality. Because deep down, every Victorian child knew the truth their parents refused to admit. Obedience may earn approval, but mischief earns memories. In the Victorian era, childhood was less about toys and more about trauma in a sailor suit complete with matching guilt buttons. In Victorian Britain, salvation didn't come from the Bible alone. It came from the Book of Manners. Across parlours, drawing rooms and shop counters, a new kind of holy text flourished, the etiquette manual. These were the silent tyrants of polite society, instructing, correcting, and haunting an entire nation into submission. Every sentence was a sermon, every rule a commandment. Don't do this. Never say that. Smile like you're mildly haunted. By the end of the century, there was a guidebook for everything except how to relax. Victorian manners books made you fear breathing wrong, and that was just chapter 1. The sheer number of these manuals was staggering. Every year, printers churned out titles like The Gentlewoman's Etiquette Book, The Habits of Good Society, How to Behave Perfectly in All Situations, and the delightfully ominous Don't, a manual of mistakes and improprieties more or less prevalent in conduct and speech. Their authors were often anonymous, as if dictated by some divine lace-gloved authority. These weren't light reading, they were weapons of moral instruction disguised as bedside companions. A single paragraph could ruin your confidence for life. One warned, "A lady who eats quickly betrays a coarse nature." Another proclaimed, "To discuss oneself in conversation is to advertise one's mediocrity." In essence, don't eat, don't suck, and definite sales don't exist too enthusiastically. The tone of these books was relentlessly confident. They spoke as though every human error was a personal failure of civilization. "Never cross your legs," one instructed. "Never tilt your head. Never display teeth when smiling." Imagine reading 300 pages of never, and still being expected to host a party afterward. The manuals didn't teach personality, they deleted it. They transformed politeness into a minefield, where the only safe action was to do nothing at all. And yet, people bought them by the millions. They weren't just like guides, they were lifelines. In a society obsessed with appearance, owning the right etiquette book was like owning moral insurance. The newly rich clung to them for legitimacy, and the aspiring middle class used them as instruction manuals for social camouflage. They promised entry into higher circles, provided you could memorize 600 pages of behavioral scripture. This book didn't just tell you how to act, it told you how to be. You were no longer a person, and you were a project. One of the most popular writers in this genre, Mrs. Beeton, of household management fame, turned domestic life into a science of politeness. She catalogued everything from how to arrange cutlery to how to dismiss servants without appearing cruel. Other authors took an even sterner tone, writing with the moral weight of a thundercloud. Samuel Smiles, in his bestseller Self-Help, insisted that success came not from birth or talent, but from constant moral effort. In other words, if you weren't happy or successful, you simply weren't trying hard enough to behave properly. These manuals didn't just cover the obvious: greetings, table manners, dress codes. They colonised every corner of daily life. There were rules for how to sit on an omnibus, how to decline a dance, how to express sorrow without emotional leakage. One even instructed women on how to faint with modesty and decorum. Men were advised on how to cough without ostentation. A society so obsessed with rules for fainting and coughing had clearly reached the peak of overthinking existence. Each edition updated itself to reflect the evolving absurdities of the age. As technology advanced, new dangers emerged. The rise of telegraphs and telephones created panic over etiquette for communication. Was it rude to send a telegram on Sunday? Should you answer a telephone with your name or a polite cough? Manuals disagreed, of course, ensuring that confusion reigned supreme. There were even guides for letter writing that dictated not only the words but the slant of the handwriting. Sloppy penmanship, they warned, revealed sloppy morals. For women, these books were both instruction and imprisonment. Every chapter reminded them that the ideal lady was invisible, infallible, and slightly terrified. A woman's greatest charm is her restraint, one declared, as if fear were an accessory. Another advised, when uncertain, smile, but not so much as to seem pleased. The advice read like a psychological endurance test disguised in lace. To be a proper lady was to become a living ghost with good posture. Men weren't spared either. The manuals told them to be courteous but never warm, friendly but never familiar. Avoid levity, they warned, for jesting betrays weakness. A gentleman's every gesture had to suggest self-control so complete that one wondered how any of them ever survived dinner without imploding. The books urged men to suppress any emotion stronger than mild approval, and if you couldn't manage that, you were advised to take up golf or colonial administration to burn it off. These etiquette manuals were relentless because they thrived on insecurity. The more rules they printed, the more people bought at them. They invented anxieties and then sold the cures. Unsure how to greet a bishop? There's a guide for that. Afraid your voice sounds provincial? There's a chapter for that too. It was the 19th century version of lifestyle marketing, convincing people that happiness could be achieved through consistent self-loathing and polished silverware. And they weren't confined to print. Newspapers reprinted sections weekly, while lecturers travelled the country giving courses in deportment. Women's clubs hosted readings where participants practiced the proper way to sit and smile, which ironically required hours of sitting and smiling. The result was a culture of self-surveillance so intense that even solitude wasn't safe. People began to judge themselves in mirrors, terrified of catching their own reflection committing a breach of decorum. By the end of the century, the manuals had done their work too well. Victorians no longer needed to be told how to behave. They'd internalised the tyranny. People could navigate a dinner party as if guided by invisible telegraphs of disapproval. Etiquette had seeped into the national bloodstream, and every British citizen became their own moral warden. The tragedy, of course, was that no one could possibly live up to all those rules. Perfection was unattainable, but failure was unforgivable. And so the nation kept buying the books, reading them, quoting them, and quietly panicking between the lines. Each new edition promised the same impossible dream, that if you behaved perfectly enough, no one would notice you were human. Because in the end, Victorian etiquette manuals didn't teach how to live, they taught how to apologise for living. Victorian manners books made you fear breathing wrong, and by chapter 2 you weren't sure if exhaling was still polite. In Victorian Britain, you didn't need to commit a crime to destroy your life, you just needed to drop a glove. Reputation was everything, and maintaining it required Olympic-level precision. The smallest social blunder could ripple through drawing rooms faster than the telegraph. One misplaced bow, one ill-timed giggle, and suddenly you weren't respectable. you were a headline in someone's gossip column. In this world of lace and paranoia, one giggle too many, and you weren't charming, you were unemployed. Victorian society was a stage where everyone performed the part of perfection, and the audience never blinked. Gossip was the true national sport, cheaper than hunting, safer than duelling, and far more lethal. A single mistake could unmake a lifetime of social climbing. The newspapers might have reported on wars and empires, but the real battles were fought in parlours over tea, where reputations were shredded as delicately as cucumber sandwiches. Consider, for instance, the dropped glove incident, a classic of the genre. To modernise, a woman dropping her glove seems trivial. To the Victorians, it was practically a declaration of war on morality. If a man picked it up, scandal. If she let him, double scandal. The glove wasn't just a glove, it was a metaphor for virtue. Etiquette dictated that a woman must never retrieve it herself, too unladylike, but she must also never allow a man to do it for her, unless he was of appropriate acquaintance. Thus, entire reputations hinged on the reflex speed of nearby gentlemen. There are documented accounts of women being gently discouraged from certain social circles after a glove mishap at a dance. Imagine losing your place in society because your fingers slipped. Men weren't immune to such disasters either. A bow, for instance, had to be executed with surgical precision. Bow too low to a lady and you were accused of forwardness. Too shallow and you insulted her honour. There was even an unspoken hierarchy of bow depth. Casual acquaintances earned a nod, respected elders a graceful tilt, and social superiors something closer to chiropractic surrender. A gentleman once bowed so fervently to a duchess that his hat flew off. The duchess laughed, the crowd gasped, and his career in polite company ended before dessert. His crime? Excessive enthusiasm. But perhaps nothing courted danger quite like laughter. To laugh too loudly was the height of vulgarity. The ideal Victorian laugh was a modest tinkle, the sound of amusement politely strangled in its cradle. Anything more was unfeminine, ungentlemanly, or possibly foreign. At parties, people learned to chuckle with decorum, producing noises so restrained they resembled mild respiratory issues. There's a record from a London dinner in 1873 where a young woman was described as too merry in disposition, a phrase that in Victorian terms was roughly equivalent to public menace. Even conversation was a minefield. You could be ruined simply for being overheard in the wrong tone. Whispering suggested secrecy. Speaking too loudly suggested coarseness. Disagreeing with someone of higher rank? Social suicide? Agreeing too eagerly? Transparent flattery. The safe option was to say as little as possible, preferably about the weather, which conveniently never sued for defamation. People didn't talk to connect, they talked to survive, and heaven help you if a rumour started. Scandal didn't need proof, it only needed witnesses with imagination. A lady seen walking alone could be declared fallen. A man spotted smiling too warmly at a widow might be branded a libertine. In one famous case, a hostess in Bath was ostracised because a guest at her dinner wore the wrong shade of morning grey. Too soon, whispered the neighbours. Too cheerful. She moved to the countryside within the month. Even the act of dancing could doom you. Victorian ballrooms were social minefields disguised as merriment. Each waltz was effectively a marriage proposal performed at arm's length. A gentleman's hand placed a fraction too low, or a lady's smile held a fraction too long, and by the next morning half of London had opinions about it. The gossip columns of the Times and the Morning Post thrived on coded descriptions of certain ladies of recent notoriety. Everyone knew who they meant, the names didn't need printing. One curt paragraph could end a family's season before it began. The paranoia extended beyond high society. Middle-class respectability was even more fragile, because it was newly earned. For them, reputation wasn't just social capital, it was survival. A shopkeeper's wife seen dining with the wrong crowd could drive away business. A governess rumoured to have accepted a letter from a gentleman would find herself dismissed before she could protest. The working classes had less to lose in name, but even they adopted their own hierarchies of propriety. Moral virtue became everyone's currency, and gossip was inflation. Etiquette manuals made it worse. Of course, they warned readers that scandal could arise from gestures too free or laughter too abundant. One particularly joyless book advised, "Let the lady be pleasant, yet never jovial, for mirth is the herald of moral decay." Imagine reading that before breakfast and still having the energy to smile at anyone. The constant fear of impropriety turned daily life into a performance with no intermission. Every outing, every conversation, every expression carried risk. People didn't live. They auditioned for the part of respectable person, hoping never to be recast as cautionary tale. And the worst part, once tainted by scandal, there was no redemption. Victorian society forgave debt, drunkenness, even mild treason before it forgave embarrassment. Scandal clung like coal dust. The only escape was exile, literal or social. Many fled to the continent, where morality was supposedly looser and dinner conversations didn't come with surveillance. The unlucky stayed behind, condemned to a lifetime of polite ostracism and half-invitations that never materialised. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at how fragile their social order was, but beneath the absurdity lay genuine terror, a culture so obsessed with appearances that one spontaneous laugh could destroy the illusion. In that world, sincerity was the ultimate scandal. It wasn't malice that maintained the system, but fear, the quiet understanding that anyone, at any moment, could become the evening's entertainment. Because in Victorian Britain, decorum wasn't just about being proper, it was about staying invisible enough to survive the next round of gossip. One giggle too many, and you weren't charming, you were unemployed, relocated, and possibly erased from polite memory. Victorian Britain didn't just fight wars with armies, it fought them with tableware. Every meal was a skirmish, every dinner party a battlefield where class warfare was waged with cutlery instead of cannons. The upper and middle classes locked horns nightly over how to sit, sip, and signal refinement. Forks were their weapons, etiquette was their armour, and passive aggression was the artillery. It was an arms race fought with forks and passive aggression. At first glance, dinner might have looked peaceful. Candlelight flickering over silver, polite conversation drifting like steam from a tureen of soup. But beneath the lace and linen lay tension sharp enough to carve a roast. The middle classes, newly rich from industry, were desperate to prove their civility. The aristocracy, meanwhile, clung to their dining rituals like relics of divine superiority. What emerged was a culture where eating became less about sustenance and more about status management. The Victorian dining room was a stage, and everyone in it was performing. The number of courses, the material of the napkins, the way the servants moved, each detail announced your place in the social hierarchy. The aristocrats had centuries of inherited habit. The middle classes had guidebooks and terror. Manuals like Manners of the Table or The Complete Hostess promised to teach aspirational families how to dine like gentlefolk, which meant learning not just how to eat, but how to look like you'd been born knowing how to eat. Every class copied the one above. The middle classes borrowed the aristocrats' formality, while the lower middle class mimicked them both in cheaper imitation. A manufacturer's wife in Manchester might insist on 12 courses served by 2 bewildered servants simply to appear genteel. The problem was that etiquette had layers. As soon as the middle class mastered one, the aristocracy invented another. It was like chasing a mirage with a soup spoon. Take the dinner courses themselves. Once, 2 or 3 dishes sufficed. By mid-century, 10 or more had become the norm for anyone hoping to appear refined. Soup, fish, roast, pudding, game, dessert, coffee, each with its own cutlery, plates, and choreography. The rich dined until etiquette manuals had to include footnotes just to remind readers when to breathe. The newly prosperous took this as a challenge. Dinner became a kind of social arms race. Who could afford more silverware, more servants, more oysters? And just as the middle class finally perfected the art of hosting, the upper class moved the goalposts. They began dining later. Where the middle classes ate at 6, the aristocracy shifted to 8, then 9, purely to demonstrate they didn't have to rise early for work. Time itself became a symbol of privilege. Fashionable lateness wasn't rudeness. It was proof that your schedule was too important to coordinate with anyone else's digestive system. Even the design of dining rooms reflected this escalating absurdity. In grand houses, dining rooms became temples of dominance, with mahogany tables so long they required diplomatic shouting to converse across, and walls decorated in dark masculine colours that said, "We are serious people who can afford discomfort." The middle class followed suit, filling their homes with oversized furniture that looked distinguished but barely fit through doors. Comfort was never the goal, impression was. The table itself was a minefield of etiquette. The placement of forks was a language. Napkin folding was an art form with the gravity of theology. Using the wrong utensil at the wrong time was social suicide. A misplaced fish knife could undo years of cultivated reputation. The aristocracy, knowing this, exploited it gleefully. They invented subtle new rituals, a twist of the wrist when pouring wine, a particular order for serving cheese, all designed to catch out imitators. The middle classes studied these moves like spies, determined to infiltrate the citadel of gentility. Servants, of course, bore the brunt of this domestic warfare. The butler's timing had to be flawless, the footman's movements synchronized like ballet. A dish served too early or too cold reflected not on the servants, but on the family's entire moral fora. Meanwhile, the middle classes, unable to afford large staffs, trained their few servants to perform miracles, juggling dishes, clearing plates and predicting the moods of guests, while pretending there was an invisible army behind them. It was theatre, and the audience was ruthless. And then there was the matter of conversation. The rich had mastered the art of effortless boredom, speaking softly of horses, politics, and cousins in the colonies. The middle class, eager to fit in, learned to imitate the tone if not the substance. Thus emerged an entire generation of people who could discuss anything except anything interesting. To be agreeable meant never disagreeing, and to be witty meant never laughing too loudly. Dinner parties became polite symphonies of blandness, broken only by the occasional scandal when someone accidentally mentioned money, trade, or, heaven forbid, digestion. Of course, money was the invisible guest at every table. For the aristocracy, fine dining was a birthright. For the middle class, it was a financial minefield. Lavish dinners meant bankrupting themselves for the sake of appearances. There are letters from the era describing families surviving on bread and tea for weeks after hosting a single society. But the risk was worth it. If your dinner succeeded, you climbed the ladder. If it didn't, you might as well have served porridge in the street. By the end of the century, this culinary Cold War had grown absurd. The upper class turned to simplicity as a final flex, serving plain roasts and pretending not to care. The middle classes, still chasing the last trend, doubled down on formality, dining beneath chandeliers so bright they could see their own nervous sweat glisten in the gravy. The result was a nation of people eating in terror. But underneath all the posturing, the truth was simple. Manners were just class anxiety with silver polish. The war of the dining rooms wasn't about refinement, it was about survival. In a world where who you were mattered less than who you could convincingly appear to be, dinner became both performance and punishment. Because in Victorian Britain, food didn't bring people together, it separated them by course. The Victorians turned eating into espionage, because nothing says refinement like a nervous breakdown over soup. In Victorian Britain, the pen was mightier than the sword, mostly because a sword couldn't destroy your reputation quite as efficiently as a poorly folded letter. The art of correspondence was a deadly game of manners, where every word, seal and signature carried the weight of one's social standing. Invitations weren't just pieces of paper, they were instruments of survival. One wrong phrase, one misplaced comma, one unfortunate choice of envelope colour, and you could kiss your social season goodbye. Victorian invites were like landmines, open carefully, or lose a season of friendships. The Victorians lived and died by the post, and the entire rhythm of polite society pulsed through envelopes. Breakfast brought gossip, lunch brought obligations, and evening brought either triumph or exile. Letters were how friendships flourished, feuds began, and flirtations bloomed under the guise of literary refinement. But every line of ink was governed by unspoken laws so complex that one could easily mistake them for ancient scripture. A simple thank you note, for example, had the emotional stakes of a diplomatic treaty. If you received an invitation, you had precisely 24 hours to respond, not sooner, too eager, not later, too arrogant. Declining an invitation required an apology so graceful it could double as a sonnet. With deepest regret was the socially approved phrasing. Sorry, can't make it, was the linguistic equivalent of slapping the host with your gloves. And heaven forbid you accepted one invitation, then backed out for a better one. That wasn't just rude, it was social treason. Then there was the stationery hierarchy, a world of absurd precision. The texture of your paper signalled your rank. The wealthy wrote on thick, cream-coloured parchment that whispered refinement with every rustle. The middle class used crisp white stock, occasionally embossed, a desperate attempt to look wealthier than they were. The poor? They didn't write at all unless it was to ask for employment, which, ironically, had its own etiquette manual too. And the colour of your wax seal was an entire language unto itself. Red was traditional, blue was fashionable, and black was for mourning. Send an invitation sealed in black by accident, and you might trigger a panic about a death that hadn't happened yet. There are genuine accounts of households descending into hysteria after receiving funeral-coloured invasions that were, in fact, just stylistic experiments. The way a letter was folded mattered too. Unmarried women were expected to fold their letters into perfect thirds, sealed neatly with no excessive wax. Too much seal implied passion. Married women could use more elaborate folds, but not so elaborate as to appear frivolous. Men were to fold their letters sharply, precisely like their emotions. If you used the wrong style for your gender or status, your letter didn't just say the wrong thing, it was the wrong thing. And then there was RSVP etiquette, the source of many a polite, nervous breakdown. Invitations to dinners, teas, or balls required swift acknowledgement, but not too swift, otherwise you look desperate for company. Declining too vaguely, unavoidably engaged, risked insult, while declining too specifically, my aunt's gout has returned, risked mockery. Accepting required enthusiasm without excitement. The safest bet was a tone of weary grace, as if your entire calendar were already overflowing with obligations, but you were nobly making room for this one. Hosts, meanwhile, wielded invitations like weapons. To receive one was validation. To be left off the list was social annihilation. Lists were curated with surgical precision. Every inclusion or omission sent a message. Some invitations were sent deliberately late to signal that you were optional, while others were sent early to flatter your supposed importance. A misplaced invite could start a feud that outlasted empires. To dine with the wrong people, one etiquette guide warned, is to dine outside the pale of civilization. Translation: accept one supper with the nouveau riche, and you'll never sip tea with the Duchess again. The post became a theatre of emotional tension. Every morning families waited for the clatter of the mail slot with the anticipation of gamblers awaiting fate. A thick envelope meant possibility, a thin one, doom. Servants often became unwilling witnesses to these daily dramas, tasked with discreetly handing over envelopes to trembling hands. Has it come? Was the question of the hour during London's social season, referring not to love letters, but to invitations to the right dinners, the right garden parties, the right everything. Even handwriting had its stakes. A slanted script indicated refinement. An uneven one suggested madness or moral decay. Many women practiced penmanship for hours to perfect the graceful hand, believing that beauty in writing reflected beauty of soul. Men favoured bold, straight strokes to signal authority, a written flex in ink. And if your handwriting was illegible, you were suspected of barbarism or worse, American influence. Letters could also ruin reputations long after they were sent. Misdelivered mail was the nightmare of the century. Imagine your private note, a subtle flirtation to a gentleman, ending up in the hands of his mother, his wife, or his gossip-hungry sister. The postal system was efficient but not infallible, and more than one engagement or friendship was destroyed by a wandering envelope. In some notorious cases, letters were deliberately misplaced by jealous rivals who understood that ink, once read, could not be unsaid, and while letters were the lifeblood of the elite, they were also the great equalizer of humiliation. The middle class, still mastering the art of social correspondence, lived in perpetual fear of writing the wrong thing. Entire industries arose to exploit that fear. Printers, paper merchants, etiquette publishers, all promising that with the right stationery and a perfectly worded note, you too could avoid eternal embarrassment. A polite letter, they said, could open any door. The problem was that it could also slam it shut forever. It's hard to overstate how much anxiety these rituals produced. People lost sleep over whether to sign yours truly or yours faithfully. An errant flourish on the Y of your name could be interpreted as arrogance. Even the timing of delivery mattered. Sending a note too early in the day was seen as presumptuous, too late as lazy. In a society where everything had to appear effortless, the effort to seem effortless became a full-time job. And yet, for all the pressure, there was beauty in it too. The Victorians turned correspondence into an art form, precise, elegant, and deeply human. Their letters, for all their paranoia, brimmed with longing, formality, and the desperate hope of being remembered correctly. A person's entire identity and their taste, education, morality could live and die inside an envelope. Because in a world obsessed with manners, reputation didn't walk into a room. It arrived in the morning post. Victorian invites were like landmines. Open carefully, reply cautiously, and pray your handwriting didn't look too emotional. If the Victorians had a national religion beyond gossip, it was cleanliness. Soap wasn't just a hygiene product, it was a moral compass. To be clean was to be virtuous. To be dirty was to flirt with damnation. The daily wash became an act of purification, not just for the body but for the soul. A spotless home meant a spotless conscience, and heaven help anyone whose collar showed a shadow of grime, because if you didn't scrub daily, people assumed your soul needed disinfecting too. This obsession didn't appear out of nowhere. The Industrial Revolution had coated Britain in a uniform shade of grey. Smoke belched from our factories, coal dust filled the air, and rivers turned colours no river should turn. Against this backdrop of industrial filth, clean became the ultimate status symbol. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about escape. The wealthy and aspiring middle classes polished, scrubbed, and scented themselves as if they could wash away the working class by sheer determination. Cleanliness became not only next to godliness, but next to respectability, prosperity, and sanity. Bathing, once considered suspiciously continental, became a moral duty. Earlier centuries had treated water with mistrust. People thought it opened the pores to disease and sin. But by the mid-19th century, the Victorians had embraced the bath with evangelical zeal. To soak daily was to announce your refinement. To skip it was to risk whispers at church. Entire manuals were written about the correct way to bathe, from the ideal temperature, tepid to avoid stimulating dangerous passions, to the duration, long enough to cleanse, short enough to avoid vanity. Bathing was done in silence and solemnity, like a private communion with decency itself. The bathroom, however, was still a luxury. Most homes didn't have indoor plumbing, so cleanliness required creativity. Servants dug hot water up endless stairs for their employers' baths, while the poor made do with tin basins or public washhouses. Still, even the humblest citizen was encouraged to make an effort. A clean face, clean hands, and clean fingernails could redeem one's reputation faster than prayer. Dirt, meanwhile, became a moral diagnosis. It didn't matter if your sooty hands came from honest labour. To be visibly unwashed was to be branded as lazy, immoral, or both. Soap manufacturers wasted no time sanctifying this hysteria. By the late 1800s, companies like Pears, Sunlight and Lifebuoy had turned hygiene into holy marketing. Advertisements didn't just sell cleanliness, they sold salvation. Posters declared that soap brings purity to the skin and virtue to the heart. Pears even enlisted artists and poets to turn washing into an aesthetic experience. Their famous campaign featuring a cherubic child with the caption, "Pure as the driven snow," didn't just sell soap, it sold the fantasy that moral worth came in bars. And people bought it, literally and spiritually. The middle classes filled their homes with soap dishes, washstands and scented towels, elevating hygiene to high art. Domestic manuals like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management devoted chapters to personal cleanliness, equating daily scrubbing with dignity and order. Women, as usual, bore the heaviest burden. A clean house reflected her character. A speck of dust implied domestic failure. The ideal Victorian woman glowed with cleanliness, not sweat. A wife's duty, one guide preached, is to maintain her husband's respect through visible purity. Translation: dust the mantelpiece or risk moral collapse. The irony, of course, was that this cult of cleanliness thrived alongside some of the dirtiest realities of the age. Behind the gleaming, middle-class bathrooms were servants who often had no access to the same luxuries. While their employers soaked in rosewater, maids and scullery workers washed themselves in cold kitchen basins after hours of scrubbing other people's dirt. The poor, meanwhile, were blamed for filth they couldn't afford to escape. Social reformers wrote pamphlets urging the lower orders to wash more often, ignoring the fact that many had to choose between soap and supper. Still, cleanliness was preached as the solution to everything from poverty to sin. Reformers claimed that teaching hygiene would uplift the masses. The great Victorian engineer Joseph Bazalgette built London's modern sewer system, an act hailed as both a public health miracle and a moral triumph. Newspapers called it a monument to virtue. Sewers had become sanctuaries, plumbing a kind of purification pipeline for the empire's conscience. It was as if the Victorians had collectively decided that if they couldn't cleanse the world's souls, they could at least scrub its drains. Public baths and washhouses soon spread across cities, funded by philanthropists who believed that soap could civilize the poor. One reformer wrote, "Where cleanliness enters, crime departs." Never mind that the two often cohabited quite comfortably, it made for a great slogan. Hygiene became social control dressed as compassion. To be clean was to be respectable. To be unwashed was to be suspect. And so cleanliness became not just a virtue, but a form of surveillance. Dirt wasn't merely undesirable, it was deviant. Even spirituality got lathered into the mix. Preachers began comparing moral salvation to washing. "Cleanse thy heart as thou cleansest thy hands," thundered one sermon. Presumably from a pulpit that smelled faintly of carbolic soap, baptismal imagery flourished, not just as a religious ritual, but as an everyday metaphor. Sin was grime, repentance, a bath. For a society terrified of moral decay, soap offered the comforting illusion that decency could be achieved through scrubbing alone. But beneath all the bubbles lay anxiety. Cleanliness was expensive, both in money and time, and maintaining it was exhausting. Women spent hours polishing brass and laundering linens to uphold reputations. Men carried handkerchiefs like shields, terrified of being caught with a smudge on their cuffs. A single ink stain could make or break an impression. To be clean wasn't enough. One had to appear effortlessly spotless, as though purity were one's natural state. By the turn of the century, the Church of Cleanliness had conquered every corner of British life. Soap was patriotism. Hygiene was holiness. The bathroom had become the confessional, the washtub a moral altar. The Victorians believed that a shining surface reflected a shining soul, even if they had to hide the dirt under the rug to prove it. Because in this empire of spotless morality, cleanliness didn't just wash away germs, it washed away guilt. and replaced it with the faint, perfumed scent of superiority. For the Victorians, virtue came in bars, and if you didn't lather daily, people assumed your conscience smelled suspicious. By the late Victorian era, the age of etiquette had eaten itself alive. What began as a guide to civility had metastasized into a national neurosis, a collective breakdown in lace gloves and polished shoes. The pressure to behave correctly, speak correctly, and even breathe correctly didn't just shape society, it shattered people inside it. Anxiety wasn't a diagnosis, it was a lifestyle choice. Every movement, every word, every glance carried social weight, and for many Victorians, that weight became unbearable. Etiquette manuals warned of vulgar gestures, gossip punished improper laughter, and even facial expressions were policed like public crimes. The result was a society teetering between order and collapse, a nation of people too polite to scream and too terrified not to. Women, as usual, bore the heaviest strain. They were expected to embody calm perfection, so pure, poised, and perpetually pleasant, even as their nerves frayed like old corset strings. The term nervous exhaustion became fashionable, a delicate euphemism for what was essentially mass emotional burnout. Doctors prescribed tonics, rest cures, and seaside air, but never admitted the obvious cause, life itself. The effort to remain elegant under the crushing weight of expectation was driving entire households to distraction. Take the case of the rest cure, a medical marvel invented by men who believed women's anxiety came from thinking too much. A typical prescription involved confinement to bed, isolation from family, and strict prohibition from reading or writing, because apparently nothing says healing like enforced boredom and staring at wallpaper until it starts talking back. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, captured the horror perfectly. A woman driven insane by the very treatment meant to make her proper again. Her descent into madness wasn't fiction, it was autobiography with better lighting. Even for those outside asylums, the symptoms of societal overpoliteness spread like a quiet plague. Women fainted at the dinner table, hyperventilated in drawing rooms, and suffered mysterious female complaints that were really panic attacks dressed in silk. Doctors blamed hysteria, a catch-all term that covered everything from anxiety to ambition. One physician noted that his female patients exhibited nervous oversensitivity to social disturbance, which is Victorian for "they're tired of pretending." Men didn't fare much better. The rigid stoicism demanded of gentlemen left them emotionally constipated and physically deteriorating. They weren't allowed to cry, shout, or confess weakness, so they developed ulcers, migraines, and a mysterious condition called neurasthenia, exhaustion of the nerves brought on by excessive self-control. One doctor described it as the malaise of the civilized, which might be the most polite diagnosis of despair ever written. Wealthy men checked into rest sanatoriums, working men simply drank and called it dinner. For the lower classes, the madness took on a different shape. They lived under the same moral microscope, but without the financial padding to survive it. Servants risked dismissal for the slightest social misstep. Clerks and shop girls spent their wages on gloves and collars just to appear respectable. Working-class women scrubbed their cottages obsessively to mimic the middle-class obsession with cleanliness, often at the cost of their own health. The psychological burden of keeping up turned ordinary existence into a marathon of exhaustion. Many spent their lives pretending to be finer, calmer, and happier than they had any earthly reason to be. The irony is that the very manuals meant to help people navigate society only deepened the madness. They promised control in a world spinning faster than anyone could manage. Industrialization, urbanization, and empire had turned daily life into a machine, loud, crowded, and relentless. Manners became the illusion of mastery, the last defense against chaos. But the more rules society invented, the less anyone could breathe. A dropped fork could ruin a meal. A delayed response to a letter could end a friendship. There was no such thing as casual. Every action had consequences, and every mistake was a moral failing. mental breakdowns were often disguised as elegance. A woman too weak to rise from her couch was praised for her delicacy. A man who refused company was described as reserved. Depression wore lace. Anxiety wore cologne. Even madness had etiquette. Asylums for the genteel were designed like country houses, complete with gardens, parlours, and tea services, so the upper class could go quietly insane without compromising their dignity. Patients were treated to routine, silence, and occasional doses of electricity, all under the reassuring belief that politeness could be shocked back into them. The phrase nervous disposition entered common speech, used so often it became practically a badge of refinement. To have fragile nerves was fashionable, a sign you were sensitive enough to suffer tastefully. But beneath the dainty phrasing lay very real pain. Diaries and letters from the time are filled with confessions of dread, loneliness, and fatigue. One woman wrote, "I live in terror of doing the wrong thing and am quite unable to determine what the right thing is." That wasn't just etiquette anxiety, that was existential despair in a corset. Among the middle class, particularly, the performance of propriety became a kind of self-inflicted torture. Families bankrupted themselves to host perfect dinners, scrubbed floors until they bled, and punished their children for being too lively. The line between respectability and ruin was so thin it could split the mind. Etiquette had promised security but delivered paralysis. Everyone was trying to appear sane in a culture that rewarded hysteria disguised as composure. By the end of the century, doctors began noticing what they called urban neurasthenia, the toll of modern manners on mental health. It was the first whisper of what we'd now call anxiety disorders. But instead of treating the cause, Victorians treated the symptoms. "Keep busy," doctors said. "Don't think too much." Society nodded and responded by inventing more rules, more rituals, more ways to appear normal while quietly unravelling inside. And so the empire continued, polished and trembling. Dinner parties sparkled, letters flowed, and everyone smiled just enough to hide the cracks. Beneath the perfume and propriety, an entire civilization was quietly coming apart. One polite breakdown at a time. Because when a society values manners above meaning, madness isn't an accident. It's etiquette taken to its logical conclusion. Victorian politeness didn't calm anyone. It just gave nervous breakdowns better posture. By the twilight of the Victorian age, not everyone was content to suffocate under layers of lace and manners. While the empire was busy polishing its spoons and repressing its emotions, a quiet revolution was brewing. One made not with muskets, but with mockery, ink, and the occasional very improper laugh. A new breed of Victorians had finally had enough of table rules, tea tension, and moral corsets. They didn't just break the rules, they spilled tea on them. These were the etiquette rebels, artists, writers, suffragettes, and assorted iconoclasts who decided that life was far too short to spend worrying about the proper angle of a bow. To them, the empire's obsession with manners wasn't a sign of civilization. It was proof that everyone had lost their minds. They poked fun at politeness, exposed hypocrisy, and in doing so gave birth to the modern sense of individuality. One of the first to lead this genteel mutiny was Oscar Wilde, who turned mockery into an art form and scandal into a hobby. While society worshipped at the altar of restraint, Wilde danced upon it in silk trousers. His wit was a direct assault on Victorian pretension. "A well-tied tie," he quipped, "is the first serious step in life." Every sentence dripped with irony, exposing how utterly apt the social code had become. His plays, like The Importance of Being Earnest, skewered the hollow politeness of drawing-room culture. Characters who said all the right things but meant absolutely nothing. Wilde's humour worked because it wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was truth disguised as comedy. He didn't reject manners entirely. He rejected the idea that manners were more important than sincerity. Then came the suffragettes, the most dangerous kind of impolite women, the kind who refused to apologise. In a world that told women to faint quietly and agree decorously, They stood in the street shouting, marching, and occasionally breaking windows. Their white dresses and purple sashes mocked the very ideals they were fighting against: purity, gentility, and obedience. They wrote pamphlets, chained themselves to railings, and went to prison with the composure of queens. Every act of rebellion was a direct challenge to the social order that demanded women be polite at their own expense. Deeds, not words, became their rallying cry, a phrase that could have given half the etiquette manuals a collective stroke. Social critics too began taking aim at the empire's obsession with appearances. Charles Dickens, that sharp-eyed chronicler of hypocrisy, filled his novels with characters who weaponized politeness. From the sanctimonious Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House to the pious frauds of Little Dorrit, Dickens made it clear that moral virtue had become a costume, worn by people who cared more about looking good than doing good. His writing mocked the idea that politeness equaled morality, exposing the gap between good manners and good hearts. For Dickens, the real gentlemen were the ones who treated others kindly, not the ones who owned 12 forks. Meanwhile, satirists like Jerome and Punch magazine found humour in the hysteria. Punch published cartoons lampooning everything from dining etiquette to the exhausting rituals of courtship. One illustration showed a dinner guest sweating profusely under a storm of cutlery, captioned, "The agony of choosing the right fork." Another mocked mourning etiquette, showing a woman draped in so much black fabric she could no longer locate her husband's grave. Humour became a coping mechanism, a way for people to laugh at the absurdity before it drove them mad. Then there were the bohemians, artists, poets, and freethinkers who fled the suffocating parlours for smoky studios and cafes. They rejected the entire system of moral decorum and built their own counterculture. In London's Soho or Paris's Montmartre, rebellion had a new aesthetic: messy hair, unconventional relationships, and a proudly unwashed authenticity that scandalised their polite contemporaries. They believed that true art required freedom, the kind that couldn't exist in corsets or cravats. To the Victorians, they looked like lunatics. To modern eyes, they were pioneers. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, for instance, defied the rigid beauty standards of the time by painting medieval dreamscapes full of untamed hair, languid poses, and scandalously natural women. Their muses were sensual, imperfect, and, to proper society, dangerously alive. Critics accused them of immorality. They called it honesty. Art for them was not meant to be polite. It was meant to feel. Even within high society, rebellion found cracks to seep through. Hostesses began hosting salons that blurred class and gender boundaries. Artists mingled with aristocrats. Writers debated with ladies of rank. And ideas, shocking, dangerous ideas, were exchanged between sips of tea. It was radical and it was intoxicating. Conversation replaced ceremony, wit replaced flattery. And for a few golden hours, people were allowed to be interesting again. Literature and art weren't the only fronts of this rebellion. Dress itself became a protest. The rational dress movement challenged the tyranny of corsets and introduced the shocking notion that women should be able to breathe. The bloomer outfit, loose trousers under a shorter skirt, sent newspapers into fits of outrage. Critics called it indecent. Supporters called it progress. Every loosened lacing was a small declaration of independence. And then, inevitably, came the philosophers and psychologists, whispering the heresy that perhaps the human mind wasn't designed to live in permanent repression. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill and early psychologists such as Henry Maudsley began questioning whether all this enforced propriety was breeding misery instead of morality. They argued that authenticity, not etiquette, was the true measure of civilization. It was a radical thought. Maybe feeling wasn't failure. By the end of the century, the etiquette empire was cracking. The younger generation, influenced by art, activism, and a growing sense of individualism, began rolling their eyes at the old rules. They still attended dinner parties, but with a smirk. They wrote letters, but with wit instead of worship. They still followed some forms, but selectively, consciously. The rebellion hadn't destroyed manners. it had redefined them. These rebels didn't burn down society, they air-conditioned it. They showed that kindness could exist without pretense, and that sincerity could be as stylish as restraint. In doing so, they paved the way for the 20th century's more open, expressive, and wonderfully chaotic idea of what it means to be civilized. Because rebellion in the Victorian age wasn't about shouting, but it was about daring to speak honestly in a room full of polite liars. They didn't just break the rules, they spilled tea on them, laughed about it, and then published a manifesto. The Victorian era may have ended more than a century ago, but its ghost still lingers, neatly dressed, overly polite, and quietly judging us from the corner. For all their lace, manners, and moral panic, the Victorians didn't just create a society, they created a template for performance, a world where behaving correctly mattered more than feeling honestly. And though we've traded top hats for touchscreens and calling cards for DMs, the performance never really ended. Victorians invented social pressure. We just added Wi-Fi. What they left behind wasn't just furniture and photographs, but an entire psychology of self-presentation. The idea that to belong, to be respectable, desirable, employable, one must always appear composed. The Victorians perfected the art of living under observation, and we, their spiritual descendants, perfected the surveillance. Their gossip happened in drawing rooms, ours happens in comment sections. The fear of scandal never disappeared. It simply migrated online, where embarrassment is both permanent and monetized. But to understand how deeply that legacy runs, you have to remember what Victorian manners were. Not merely rules, but armour. The era's obsession with etiquette was born from insecurity. Industrialization had scrambled the class system. Money was making new people rich and old families anxious. Politeness became the great equalizer and the great divider. A code of behaviour that could elevate or exile. It promised stability in a world changing too fast. Sound familiar? We've just swapped parlours for platform, the dinner table for the feed, and still, everyone's pretending to be okay under the same relentless gaze. Gender too carries the hangover. The Victorians sculpted femininity into fragility and masculinity into repression, mould so strong that their outlines still show in our modern discomfort with vulnerability. A proper lady was calm, agreeable, and perpetually graceful. A proper man was stoic, successful, and allergic to feelings. Today the corsets are gone, but the pressure remains invisible and internal. Women still wrestle with being likeable, men still fear softness, and both are haunted by the same old script. Be perfect, or at least look it. Even our modern concept of professionalism owes its starch to Victorian morality. Cleanliness, punctuality, restraint, these weren't just workplace virtues, they were moral imperatives in the 19th century. The ideal employee was a model of quiet obedience, a remnant of the servant class in industrial disguise. That legacy lives on every time someone's told to smile more in customer service or tone down emotion in an office meeting. Victorian virtue still dictates the dress code. The empire may have fallen, but the cubicle remains. The Victorians also embedded in us the constant fear of being seen the wrong way. They turned self-consciousness into a national sport. Social climbing demanded vigilance, posture, accent, decorum. Everything had to be curated to signal belonging. That anxious awareness of how others perceive us? That's not new. It's just traded the gaze of the drawing room for the algorithm. Victorians measured approval in whispered compliments and dinner invitations. We measure it in likes and follows. The mechanisms changed, but the tension's the same. The desperate hope that we're performing the part convincingly. Their obsession with morality through appearance also birthed our modern love of aesthetic virtue. In Victorian times, a spotless home and calm demeanour proved one's moral worth. Today, it's minimalist decor and wellness routines. Cleanliness is still next to godliness, only now it smells faintly of eucalyptus and comes with an influencer discount code. We call it self-care, but deep down it's still a ritual of proving worth through presentation. The empire of etiquette became the empire of image. Even our modern politeness, those reflexive sorries, no worries, and just checking in, echoes Victorian linguistic gymnastics. They taught us to soften every sentence, to coat even confrontation in sugar. They believed good manners could hide any emotion too unseemly to admit. We still use language to disguise discomfort, though our versions are shorter and sent by text. No rush is the new "if it pleases you." Per my last email is the new "I beg to differ, madam." The grammar changed, the passive aggression didn't. The lasting damage of that legacy isn't just external, it's psychological. Victorians taught generations to mistrust authenticity, to smile through distress, to repress emotion until it could be privately suffered in silence. It's the root of the keep calm and carry on mentality, the emotional stoicism that still defines British culture and, by extension, much of the Western world. Therapy might be more common now, but the idea that feelings are messy and should be tidied away like dust under a rug, that's pure Victorian inheritance. Yet, for all their rigidity, there's something tragically human about the Victorians' performance. They were terrified of chaos, of losing control, of being seen as less than ideal. Their elaborate codes were an attempt to build order from anxiety. And maybe that's why their influence endures, because we're still doing the same thing, only faster, with Wi-Fi and worse posture. We curate, we filter, we craft our digital identities with the same trembling care they used to fold their letters. Every selfie, every LinkedIn update, every polite email is a modern form of calling card and proof we exist and that we're still respectable enough to be invited in. But here's the final irony. The Victorians, for all their pretending, would likely look at us and marvel. They at least knew they were performing. Their etiquette books were literal instruction manuals for artifice. We, on the other hand, mistake our performances for reality. Our politeness has gone subconscious. Our filters are invisible. The empire of manners won. It just changed its wardrobe. Still, there's hope in recognizing where it all began. Knowing that our compulsive need to appear perfect has roots in a century that mistook repression for refinement lets us laugh, and maybe loosen our collars a little, because the greatest rebellion against Victorian values isn't breaking the rules, it's admitting you were never meant to follow them in the first place. After all, the Victorians spent their lives pretending to be fine. The least we can do is be honest enough to say we're not, and mean it. The Victorians spent decades pretending to be perfect. We just turned it into a full-time job with better lighting and wireless guilt.